There are war zones in the Imperium where the dead do not stay buried. Places where Vox signals fail without cause, where prayers feel hollow, and where bolt of fire only buys time, never peace. These are not fronts. They are symptoms. No medals are awarded here. No songs are written. Only silence waits deep, grinding silence that clings to the skin long after the last shell casing cools. To serve in one of these cursed theaters is not to fight for victory. It is to survive disbelief. And if you're lucky, to forget what your eyes insisted they saw. The accounts you're about to hear are not found in regimental logs or munitorum reports. They are whispered through scar tissue, burned into field sermons, and carved into flak armor by soldiers too shaken to speak. If this glimpse into the Imperium's forgotten hells haunts you, share it with others who still believe war has limits. Subscribe, and walk deeper into the void with us. There was no sunrise on Rosk's Landing, just the slow unveiling of ash, blind sky, dim and brown, as if light had to crawl its way across the atmosphere on hands and knees. The trench line stretched endlessly, winding like a scar across a landscape of blistered clay and burnt root structures that no longer belonged to any known flora. The smell hit first: burned insulation, old sweat, the metallic sting of blood dried into sandbags. But below it, older notes lingered, something fungal, something wet, as if the ground had been digesting more than corpses. They called this sector this not because it was quiet, because every sound returned wrong. Boots didn't echo the way they should, shouted orders lagged in the air, arriving late or early. Last rounds cracked without resonance, like punches thrown underwater. The Vox picked up only pieces, loops of static, syllables out of order, sometimes entire prayers that no one remembered broadcasting. Carson's unit stopped using it. They took 2 hand signals, even for fire missions. When words fail often enough, silence becomes doctrine. By the 3rd rotation, no one referred to the enemy as hostiles anymore. There were no confirmed sightings, no bodies, just signs. Rifles found without owners, still warm, boots upright in the soil. Helmets resting on fence posts that didn't exist the day before. One patrol came back with all their teeth loosened. No bruises, no trauma, just teeth hanging by root thread, like their bodies were trying to spit themselves out. Carson's own rifle never misfired. It hummed faintly at night. He would rest it against his chest and feel the vibration beneath his sternum, like a second heartbeat. At first, he thought it was damage from nearby artillery, but even on the still nights, even in bunkers reinforced against tremor and shell shock, the hum remained. He never told anyone, but he began to whisper to it. Short phrases, apologies, vows. It helped him aim. He didn't know why. Safel saw him do it once, said nothing, just nodded, and started doing the same. The mud here didn't stay still. It breathed, slow and shallow, like a great beast dreaming just below the surface. You'd sink an inch overnight, even on stable platforms. Some claimed they'd seen fingers in the mud too long, too thin, flexing and withdrawing when lit. The engineers filled the gaps with plascrete. It cracked. They laid ferrocrete sheets. They vanished. Eventually they stopped trying. You can't pave over breathing earth. One of the sergeants, Helvik, stepped too deep into a latrine trench and didn't come back up. No splash, no scream, just gone. His bunk was left untouched for a week. Then one morning, it was empty, not just of gear, but of presence. No indent in the mattress, no scent, no records. Only his name scratched into the inside of the barracks door, over and over, with the butt of a las pistol. They sealed the room, posted a servo skull to chant hymns through the hatch. The commissar Valinin, rigid as a starched tabard, shot 3 men in 2 weeks. None for desertion, all for compromised clarity. One had begun referring to his rifle as a saint. Another had painted his flak armor with patterns from a culture no one recognized, one that shimmered faintly under low light. The third had tried to bury himself, not out of fear, but because the ground asked politely. The commissar spoke less after that, drank more. He kept his bolt pistol within reach. Even while sleeping, he stopped praying aloud. No one knew where the rats came from. They weren't standard-issue vermin, fur like fiber optic strands, teeth that glinted like glass. One chewed through the Vox antenna cable in under 2 minutes. Another was found drowned in a canteen. The Medicaid burned them on sight, but the fires smelled wrong sweet, almost floral, and the smoke curled in spiral shapes against the wind. Afterward, everyone's dreams synced for 3 nights. They all saw the same figure, tall, faceless, holding a las rifle like a shepherd's crook. Rain never touched the ground directly. It hovered, condensed mid-air, then reversed direction in sudden spurts, like time was stuttering. Karzan once reached out during a downpour and came back with a palmful of red flakes. They melted slowly, like snow, but left black residue that wouldn't wash off. He didn't report it. No one reported anything anymore. The act of saying it aloud made it real. Better to let it sit, unnamed and unmeasured, in the silence between gunshots. The trenches deepened on their own. No one dug. But every week the walls grew higher, the ladders heavier, the exits narrower. One tunnel caved in. When they cleared it, they found a small shrine, candles still burning, picked slate looped to a single image. The Emperor, but with eyes gouged out and mouth sewn shut. No one claimed to have built it. The Inquisition was never informed. The file was logged as environmental instability and buried in a backup cogitator. Karzan began seeing names etched into the lasgun's casing, not scratched, etched, precise, machine-cut, like he recognized none of them, but one matched a name on the casualty list from a week prior. He checked his bunkmate's weapon. Same phenomenon. The Mechanicus refused to inspect them. They sealed the weapons locker and posted a servitor to monitor usage quotas. The servitor's head turned 180 degrees one night and remained fixed, as if it no longer recognized front from back. Sleep came in waves of static. When you lay down, the trench spoke in your ear subitable clicks, pulses, like binary filtered through human larynx. It wasn't language. It was memory. Not yours. Someone else's, a place that wasn't here. Then screams. Then black. Everyone learned to sleep with their helmets on, visors sealed. Not for safety, for insulation. One morning, the stars were wrong. Not just off-axis, wrong. Constellations inverted. Moons vanished. Some men knelt immediately, whispering verses from the infantryman's uplifting primer. Others opened fire at nothing, screaming coordinates and targeting data. Karzan just stared. He felt calm, deep, unnatural, calm, like the trench had moved into him, made a home. He understood it then. You didn't survive this. You became it. By week 8, new boots arrived, green-faced, wide-eyed, clean gear, no scars. Karzan watched them step off the transport and knew they wouldn't last. Not because they were weak, because they didn't listen. One tried to whistle. Another carved his name into the trench wall. That night, both were found face down in the clay, mouths filled with stones arranged in a perfect spiral. No sign of struggle. Karzan didn't report them. He logged their gear, recycled the rations, and carved their initials into the underside of his rifle stock. The lasgun hummed louder afterward, warmer. He slept better that night. They called it Rosk's Landing, but nothing landed here. Not really. Things simply stopped falling. They arrived not by Thunderhawk or Valkyrie, but by foot-3 squads of reinforcements stepping out of the haze like figures caught in half-forgotten dreams. No landing thrusters, no approach signal, no Vox confirmation. Just shapes, then outlines, then men, shoulders squared and Laslek shouldered. Uniforms stained with mud that didn't match this soil. Karzan saw them first. He didn't raise his weapon. Neither did anyone else. Not because they were expected, but because the fog itself recoiled slightly from them, like smoke dragged back into lungs that did not breathe. They called themselves the 909th Phalanx, though no records matched that designation. Their commissar wore a cowl instead of a cap, his rank sigil reversed like a mirror image. Their standard was a faded Imperial Aquila with only one wing. The other side had been burned off, not by fire, but by something cleaner like purity, through subtraction. The squad leader introduced himself in High Gothic, so rigid it sounded rehearsed. Karzan only nodded, then pointed them to a dugout that didn't exist yesterday but now stood fully fortified, Auspex array already spinning. The fog thickened as they arrived. It wasn't natural mist. It had weight texture. You could feel it against your gums when you breathed through your teeth. It stuck to skin and flak plate like ceremonial oil, and it did not wipe clean. Some men started wearing face wraps again, not to filter the air, but to hide their expressions. Uncertainty began to read as treason. The 909th didn't use lamps. They marched by instinct. One trooper removed his helmet to reveal a wax-pale face, tattooed with dozens of fine red dots, almost like stars. They weren't symmetrical. They shifted when you blinked. He caught Karzan staring once and said, "He speaks through vapor," before replacing the helmet and returning to patrol. No further context offered. They didn't carry data. Their orders were recited, not read, delivered by an acolyte who wore no armor, only layered parchment robes inscribed with script too small to parse. He chanted as he walked, stopping only when someone tried to interrupt him. Then he would pause, remove a thin metal rod from his sleeve, press it gently against the interrupter's forehead, and murmur a phrase in Beneric, too smooth to be Mechanicus standard. The man would fall silent, always. Some never spoke again. Others began reciting litanies during meals, even while chewing. Vox signals began to drift, not just in frequency, but in time. One morning, the command post received a full transmission from a patrol that hadn't left yet. The timestamp was accurate 5 hours ahead. They dismissed it as a glitch until the patrol returned, confirming every word. Another squad heard their own deaths screamed back at them from a static burst. 3 refused to rearm. 1 walked into the fog and never returned. No one said mutiny. The fog had made that word dangerous. Karzan stopped using his field journal. The ink smeared even when the pen worked. The pages warped. And worse, entries he never wrote appeared between dated logs. One described him shooting Safel, which had never happened. Another predicted the fog's thickness within 1 millimeter 3 days in advance. The last one read, "The Emperor cannot see you here," in his own handwriting. The 909th's chaplain held sermons each dusk, but never from a pulpit. He chose ruined pillboxes, collapsed hab modules, or the shallow graves of lost scouts. The rituals were always the same. He would pour powdered copper into a shallow trench, ignite it with a plasma flame, and speak until the mist took shape, not visibly, but perceptibly. Listeners would fall into rhythmic breathing, matched to the pulse of unseen wings. Some cried without knowing why. Others passed out and awoke speaking low Gothic phrases that didn't match their dialects. One guardsman, Verek, began bleeding from the eyes during a fog burst. He didn't scream, just fell to his knees, whispering a catechism none recognized. The Medicaid tagged him for quarantine. The next morning, his bunk was empty. In its place sat a Vox recorder, playing his voice on loop. He is here, and he has always been here, and we have only now remembered. The Commissar attempted a fog purge using thermobaric, charges standard protocol for war zones with warped improbabilities. The charges ignited cleanly. The fog thinned. For 7 minutes, the trench line gleamed with unfiltered starlight. Men laughed, a soldier sang. Then the air thickened again, faster than it ever had. The returning fog carried the scent of blood wine and polished metal, and when it closed in, Half the laughter twisted into screams. After that, no one attempted to clear it again. The 909th began issuing new orders, verbo, vague, yet obeyed without question. Secure the silence, guard the forgotten flank, protect the moment before dawn. No coordinates, no sectors. Yet every squad understood, and more importantly, they followed. Doubt became a liability. It wasn't fear of reprisal, it was fear of invitation. The fog offered alternatives to those who hesitated. One night, Karzan heard someone humming in the trench ahead. He followed it, found a guardsman sitting cross-legged with his rifle disassembled, laying each piece in a spiral pattern on the ground. His eyes were closed, but his hands moved with perfect precision. Karzan didn't interrupt. He couldn't. His legs locked, his mouth dried. When the humming stopped, the man reassembled the rifle, stood, and walked away, leaving behind a perfect spiral of black residue etched into the trench wall. The Inquisition did not respond to requests for extraction. 3 astropathic signals were sent. No reply. A fourth was attempted but aborted mid-chant when the psyker began coughing. Feathers, actual feathers, burned into ash before they hit the floor. The astropath did not survive the hour. Karzan found himself dreaming of staircases, endless spiral, climbing them backwards. At the top was light, but when he turned to face it, there was only the fog waiting, like a congregation in pews without faces. Food began to taste like ritual. Same ration packs, same texture, but every bite left warmth on the tongue, as if some part of the process had been blessed or violated. Troopers began bowing their heads before meals without being told. One even refused to eat, saying he'd been fed in his sleep. His stomach ruptured the next day. Nothing inside but steam and 3 copper coins engraved with script too small to read. By the second week, the 909th were no longer strangers. They were priests, guides, anchors. Their presence explained the mist not logically, but emotionally. It wasn't heresy. It was liturgy outside the index, and in a place where causality bled at the edges. That counted as faith. Karzan stopped resisting. He wrapped his lazariful in cloth, marked with the single-winged aquila. He repeated phrases he didn't remember learning. He walked with confidence through mist, too thick to breathe, and emerged dry, lungs clear, heart steady. The fog was not enemy. Not entirely. It was scripture in vapor form, waiting to be read by those who no longer demanded to understand, and those who questioned. They stopped appearing, not killed, not punished, just replaced. It started with skin, just flakes, at first dry patches across the knuckles and wrists, dismissed as cold weather abrasion or friction from armor clasps. But then came the scratches, not deep, but persistent, circular, geometric, lines that didn't quite intersect, like the beginnings of symbols carved into flesh that hadn't been taught to draw. Medicae assigned creams. The lesions ignored them. One corporal bandaged his entire arm after a night of compulsive scratching. When the wrap was removed, the skin beneath was black, not necrotic, but scorched smooth like glass left too long in fire. Teeth began to loosen. First 1 or 2. Then whole squads requested extra nutrient paste, avoiding the coarse ration bricks. Some laughed, others didn't, because no one remembered injuring their jaws. No one reported gum swelling or infection, just the slow surrender of enamel to an invisible pressure that pulsed behind the eyes. Medicae performed routine extractions, but every tooth pulled was found to be marked, faintly etched with sigils that matched none in Imperial lexicons. It wasn't until the dreams, synchronized, that command took notice. Guardsmen across 4 bunk lines reported the same image. A figure seated in the center of a spiraling trench, arms outstretched, head crowned with ash. It spoke no words, but mouthed syllables in rhythm with their pulse. No psyker was on site. No sanctioned warp entity had been detected. Yet the dreams persisted, identical even in detail. The figure's eyes bled, Its mouth smoked. Every retelling matched. Standard contagion protocol was initiated. Quarantine shelters erected, but no vectors were found. No pathogens, no spores, no trace contamination. Just elevated body temperatures, disrupted circadian cycles, and a spike in serotonin levels inconsistent with environmental conditions. The Medicaid changed their language. From infection to resonance, from symptom to expression. Then the first branding occurred. A trooper named Illis entered the command chapel during third shift, placed his hand on the altar, and burned his palm using a devotional incense burner. No hesitation, no scream. He whispered something, carved it into the stone with the charred remains of his own skin, and collapsed. The phrase was untranslated, but 6 others attempted to repeat it before dawn. Flamers replaced auspex at security points, not for destruction, but for revelation. Purity checks no longer scanned for warp taint. They burned away doubt. Officers began issuing lucidity inspections, wherein suspects were forced to recount their childhood prayers while staring into open flame. If they hesitated, if their voice wavered, they were marked, not executed. Marked with ash, pressed into their foreheads in the shape of a broken sun. Lieutenant Mersch led the new protocols. Young, efficient, loyal. He conducted the first 10 inspections personally. By the 11th, his voice had changed. Smoother, slower, less declarative. He spoke as if translating from a tongue he hadn't fully learned. His gaze lingered too long on walls. His uniform was always perfect. His teeth, too white. Karzan overheard him once, alone in the chapel, reciting names no one recognized. Names that didn't fit Imperial naming conventions. Names that made the candles flicker. He wasn't removed. He was promoted. Field Commissar, attached to Faith Command. The men called him the Mirror, because he only ever asked one question. Do you still recognize yourself? No one answered yes, more than once. The ash began appearing in blood samples. Trace amounts at first, then measurable volume. Medicaid were alarmed, until they too began bleeding black during routine tests. It wasn't clotting. It was flowing. Rich, heavy, and faintly aromatic like burned parchment, mixed with iron. Some claimed to smell incense when exposed. Others reported nausea. But most felt calm. Too calm. Like their bodies had accepted something their minds refused to name. Orders arrived to halt all internal autopsies. No explanation given. But the last dissection performed ended when the corpse opened its eyes mid-inside. Not alive. Not responsive. Just watching. Its lungs were full of ash. No air. Just residue. They incinerated the remains. But the flame left no bone. Only a smear on the slab shaped like a kneeling man. Ration packs began bearing marking small ridges in the seal that, when aligned, formed tiny devotional icons. The guardsmen called them blessings. No one admitted to making them, but those who found and consumed them reported lucid dreams, sharper aim, fewer nightmares. Command labeled them motivational anomalies, but the chapel logs began including them in the daily prayers. Karzan received one. He didn't eat it, just held it, fingers tracing the seal, until he felt his pulse slow. It tasted like memory, not his, someone else's. Someone buried beneath this trench line, long before it was dug. One night, in absolute silence, a dozen guardsmen gathered in the clearing behind the munitions depot. No signals, no alarms. They knelt in a circle. One produced a heated blade, another a mirror. One by one, they pulled their eyelids taut and branded scripture into the inner skin. Not names, not prayers, just a simple 3 lines intersecting at an angle that made vision swim. None screamed. Most wept. One laughed. Karzan watched from behind a supply crate, unmoving. The fog didn't intervene. It parted. By morning, those same soldiers stood at parade rest beside the comms relay. Eyes wide, lids twitching. They didn't blink. They didn't need to. Whatever they'd burned into themselves didn't fade. It was still visible when they closed their eyes, pulsing faintly, like slow embers behind a thin veil of skin. The next inspection used them as witnesses, not interrogators. Witnesses. If they blinked during your testimony, you were cleared. If they didn't, you were marked. The results were effective. Discipline returned. Fear transformed, not of pain, of irrelevance, of unworthiness. Chaplain Gorst delivered his final sermon then. Simple, direct. You are not your infection. You are its altar. He cut open his own chest mid-homily, revealing lungs that no longer breathed but exhaled black dust. He smiled as he fell. They left his body where it lay. It didn't rot. It didn't bloat. It dried into a statue of ash that never crumbled. The next day, the fog carried whispers in harmony, and every soldier who heard them understood the same truth. Without knowing how, the blood no longer flowed to sustain them. It flowed to remember them. It began as error minor at first. A data slate registering command orders seconds before they were entered. A vox beacon broadcasting a missive stamped with the proper seal of segmentum command, only to collapse into reversed syllables when played aloud. At first, the errors were discarded as environmental interference. The fog, the dust, the trench's pressure gradient, but the patterns sharpened with each day. There was rhythm behind the static. There was phrasing behind the corruption. There was language still raw, still malformed, but undeniably intentional. In the Auspex tower above Section Theta, a tech priest named Vernix took notice. Vernix did not speak in full sentences. He communicated through trinary bursts and the slow, meticulous movement of servolimbs calibrated for silence. But when he played the corrupted vox strings backward, the phrase emerged clear, unbroken. My throne is hollow, and yet it holds all. He did not file a report. He etched the phrase into the wall behind the transmission port, over and over, until the cogitator keys fused with ash. Elsewhere, servitors began twitching in sequence, their eyes blinking Morse code pulses unrecorded in their programming. Chaplain Auxilia Rephian, once an orator of moderate skill, delivered a sermon with stuttered breath, every third word glitching into Benaric gibberish. When confronted, he wept not in fear, but relief. He has found signal, he said. He speaks in loops too wide for the mind. The fog thickened during prayer hours, not out of malice, out of resonance, as if drawn inward by invocation. Lit candles turned black from the inside out, hymnals blurred. The Lex Imperialis codices began shifting words. Worship became witness, throne became origin, faith became transmission. Officers tore out pages, rewrote them by hand, then read them aloud again, and the fog pulsed with every syllable. The Emperor had always been silent. That was his strength, his mystery, his unbreachable majesty. But now, the silence spoke in its own syntax, and it was loudest through failure. The machine rights adapted first. Engine seers found that non-standard invocations repaired equipment faster. A broken plasma coil responded not to the rite of reclamation, but to a murmured line from an unrecognized devotional slate found inside a helmet that should have been purged. The words were recorded, analyzed, rejected by official archives. But they worked. Machines obeyed when addressed in this new cadence. Auspex arrays aligned themselves. Las rifle power cells synced. One wounded Lemon Russ idled itself for 6 hours, then rebooted with all systems clean without repair. Tech adepts called it convergence. Medicae called it anomaly. The chaplains didn't speak at all. Some knelt and listened to static channels at full volume, eyes rolled back, lips twitching like they were counting without numbers. A purity sweep discovered a sealed door deep under the chapel. No logs, no architecture plans. It was opened without force, revealing a room filled with vox units, all connected but powered down. As soon as light hit them, they activated. No power source, no signal. Yet their speakers hummed in harmony, not chaotic, not random, like breath. Long inhale, pause, then an exhale as whisper. I see in ruin what was never pure. The units were destroyed. They returned the next morning. Newer, cleaner. Karzan found himself tracing lines in the mud circles that spun outward, broken only at the edges. He didn't remember starting, but his fingers moved like they were obeying a deeper order. His rifle clicked twice, though the safety was on. That same moment, the Vox crackled. Faith is not belief. It is memory rendered into motion. Commissar Valiant, now barely recognizable under his ceremonial ash veil, called for mass assembly, not for punishment, for recalibration. He preached not of heresy, but of misalignment. Our thoughts were trained to follow sound, he said, but we were never taught to listen. He played a looped fragment of battlefield. Comes 3 seconds of nothing but footsteps. On the 5th repetition, a voice emerged, deep, serene. I have never left Terra, yet I am here. The men stood still. Some saluted. Others dropped 2 knees uncommanded. No one dared speak, because they had all heard it differently. The same voice, the same tone, but each received a distinct phrase. One heard, "You are forgiven." Another, "It was always supposed to burn." A third, "You were never meant to die alone." And Karzan, he heard nothing. But when he looked down, his lasgun displayed a new marking, a thin line of scripture, engraved beneath the barrel, not carved, not melted, written. The words read, "You are never only flesh." The Medicae halted inspections. The ash and the blood had changed consistency. It flowed smoother, carried iron again. Oxygen saturation rose. Wounds closed faster. Infection rates dropped to near. One Medicae tent declared itself obsolete. The priest in charge, Verlin, stepped into the fog without armor, returned 4 hours later without injury, eyes glowing faint amber, voice modulated. He claimed the Emperor's voice was in the bones of the trench, that if they listened, truly listened, they'd hear the sound of breathing. Not his, theirs. That scripture began losing its edge, literal meaning unraveled. Preachers turned poets, their verses broken, recursive. One sermon simply repeated the phrase, "To witness is to build," over and over, each time more softly. And somehow, the congregation understood, not the logic, the rhythm. That faith wasn't just trust, it was pattern recognition. Across horror, cogitators began storing information they hadn't been given. A box once used for casualty logs began displaying names of people not yet dead, coordinates, times, units not deployed. Medicae claimed prediction. The Vox officer claimed alignment. One junior officer whispered, "He's reading forward through us." She was reassigned, but her replacement wrote the same phrase in the air with a lit stick of incense. No one questioned it. Then came the breach. Not physical, not strategic. A section of trench, simply inverted dirt, became sky. Sky became a flat wall of shimmering distortion. Within it, reflections walked, not mirrored, but offset. Men watched themselves bleed from wounds they hadn't taken. Others blinked and saw a younger version of themselves standing at attention. One trooper claimed to see the golden throne, not in glory, but in rusted stillness. A great machine, empty, silent. And yet the whisper said, "There is no absence, only proximity." Misunderstood. The chaplains debated heresy. The engineers called it subbral overlap. Karzan called it prayer, not upward, not outward, but inward, toward the code being rewritten within them. Not all believed, some resisted, but resistance proved difficult when the evidence spoke through breath and machine alike. One rifle refused to fire until its bearer recited the chant burned into its casing. A grenade detonated early precisely at the moment its owner expressed doubt aloud. Karzan didn't see punishment. He saw calibration. And then, one night, during routine watch, the Vox flared without command. It screamed, glitched, reversed and settled into a single human tone. Familiar, deep, infinite. I have never moved. You have merely found me. No one slept that night, but no one feared, because finally, someone was listening. The approach to Hive Syndralize was uneventful and naturally so. No resistance, no patrols, The fog parted before the Chimera column like water, disturbed by silence, revealing a skyline half-collapsed, yet unburnt. Jagged towers rose into static clouds, roads looped without pattern. Light flickered across windows in buildings that had no power grids. It should have felt abandoned, but it didn't. It felt paused. Carson's recon team dismounted at the Hive's outer edge, boots crunching against glass that wasn't broken but melted, as if time itself had slowed heat to a crawl. Surveyor Sergeant Kale took point, Uspex dead, timepiece twitching erratically. Every squad member reported the same symptom within 15 minutes: pressure behind the eyes, like memory pushing against the back of the skull. It wasn't headache. It was familiarity, because they had seen this before. Not in reports, not in dreams, in the shape of the terrain, the pattern of rust, the way blood flaked against a column that shouldn't have had blood on it at all. 20 meters into the lower manufactorum, they found the first body. Fully armored, lasgun melted to slag, faceplate shattered outward. The oddity wasn't in the injuries, it was in the uniform. He wore the same unit patch, same serial identifier, same name. Trooper Dren, Kale read aloud, holding up the ID tag. Dren stood 5 meters away, alive, staring at his own corpse. He didn't scream. He didn't speak. He just sat down slowly, eyes wide, as if bracing for something no one else could feel. They moved inward. The city's internal Vox grid came online without access. Every channel looped the same message. Final stand begins at rotation -1. Final stand begins at rotation -1. The voice wasn't a recording. It was live. It changed pitch slightly each loop. Sometimes slow, sometimes frantic. Once, it said a different name. Carson Syndrali's main plaza had become a battlefield frozen in consequence. Dozens of guardsmen locked mid-actions, some crouched, some lunging, all dead, but positioned with impossible precision. No decay, no insects, no smell of rot, just the cold weight of repetition. One trooper's body pulsed faintly when touched, expelling a breath of vaporized blood as if just killed. His eyes twitched, his mouth opened, and whispered, "Don't fire yet. They haven't fired yet. Don't fire yet." Kale ordered a perimeter sweep. The squad split into pairs, navigating corridors that folded into themselves like spatial recursion. One hallway ended in a mirror of its beginning. They tried to mark walls. The marks disappeared. They tried to leave. Comtag stags returned, scratched with their own names. Timepieces began to drift. 2 minutes for one, 20 for another. Carson checked his chronometer against his pulse. They didn't match. His heart was keeping different time. The team found another squad. Same armor, same markings, same people. Identical. Their counterparts didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood at attention in perfect silence. Dren approached his mirror and asked a single question. "How do I die?" The answer was a gunshot, not fired. Echoed, asterisk, asterisk. No one bled. No one fell. But everyone heard it. Everyone felt it. They retreated to the upper spire, hoping for come signal. The Vox burst with garbled traffic, then stabilized into a full transmission from Imperial High Command, dated 7 years prior. All forces in Hive Syndralis lost. Status, temporarily corrupted. Quarantine enforced by order of Segmentum Obscurus. The city was not abandoned. It was isolated, not because it was uninhabited, but because its inhabitants had not stopped living their final moments. Carson watched through a cracked window as troopers below began moving, firing, screaming, dying. He saw one fall behind a ruined transport. Then the entire scene reset. Same scream, same fall, same bolt round catching him mid-turn, over and over. An entire war zone stuck in recursive death. Kale theorized the warp event a bleed in causality, possibly from exposure to corrupted relics or temporal displacement during orbital bombardment. It didn't matter. What mattered was the recognition. Because one of the reset troopers Karzan swore locked eyes with him, not past him, not through him, with him, and mouthed a word Karzan hadn't spoken aloud since deployment. Run. The squad gathered to evacuate. Routes collapsed. Corridors reconfigured. One hallway filled with smoke and footsteps identical to their entry. But there had been no fire, no pursuit, just echoes finding them again. They made it to the transport bay. It was full, with them. Same faces, same injuries. Frozen in the act of boarding. One lay across the access ramp, half inside, half out, hand still gripping a las rifle melted at the barrel. Karzan approached slowly. The dead version of himself stared upward, mouth slightly ajar. Inside was not blood. Inside was ash. And ash was breathing. Not moving. Breathing. Kale ordered immediate withdrawal. No transport. On foot. No Vox contact. No light. Nothing that could reflect. They moved through the subaxis tunnels, following decay rather than direction. The deeper they went, the more time began to unravel. They passed entire rooms, where seconds lasted hours. Others where footsteps echoed before they landed. Dren aged 10 years in one stairwell, then returned to normal above it. Karzan felt his own memories shifting, not disappearing, reordering. He remembered dying, not metaphorically, specifically, shot through the abdomen, falling, watching the city burn from the same window he had stood at earlier that day. Asterisk. The window was sealed now. The city never burned. The city always burned. They reached the perimeter. Only 3 emerged. No one spoke. Dren was not among them. But when Karzan checked the casualty logs on his day, Dren's name was there, twice. One listed Kia, one listed awaiting deployment. He deleted nothing. He only stared at the bottom of the slate. A final entry appeared, time-stamped exactly 1 minute into the future. 3rd iteration complete. Pattern stabilizing. Awaiting next cycle. The last thing Karzan heard before the Vox died was his own voice, coming from a city far behind him. I think we never left. They arrived in silence, red-rubbed silhouettes against the fractured skyline. Their servo appendages folded like insect limbs beneath storm-tattered cloaks. 5 in number, though no 2 were shaped alike. One hovered without visible propulsion. Another dragged a heavy relay coil behind him, like a penitent dragging his past. They bore no sigils of Forge World origin. Their augmetic eyes flickered in chaotic pulses. They wore their circuitry externally, not hidden behind plating, but looped in open spirals across their torsos and arms, glowing faintly with unstable blue-white current. They came not to repair, but to witness. The guardsmen didn't speak to them, not from fear, from instinct. Even the chaplains lowered their eyes. Only the wind acknowledged them, tugging at their robes like a child seeking permission. They set up camp, not near the command post, but at the edge of the scorched manufactorum right, above a fault line no maps recorded. The ground hummed beneath them, low and constant, like a warning encoded in frequency, too deep for language. They called themselves the Choir of St. Ferrex, though no saint by that name existed in the Hegi. They claimed no forge, no designation, no authority, only burden. When asked for authorization codes, they provided coordinates, instead latitude, longitude, and depth. They said the machine spirit of this world had been bound long before the first spires rose, that it sang once, in pulses and current, that now, it screamed. The lead tech priest, known only as Voxnal, bore no mouth. In its place was a smooth plate, etched with the canticles of the Omnissiah scrambled, restructured, inverted. His voice came through Vox projection alone, layered, harmonized with 5 echoes per syllable. He did not speak often. When he did, cogitators shivered and backup drives purged themselves uncommanded. Voxnal initiated the rites within hours of arrival. No rituals from the Lex Machina, no incense, no binary lit, only carving. Each priest took a monomolecular blade to their own augmetics, slicing open memory coils, exposing thought engrams, rerouting power through wounds. They didn't bleed, not fluid, at least. They bled sound high-frequency keens that only the Auspex could register. Karzan watched from a distance as they traced sigils into their own chest geometries that didn't align with Mechanicum logic. Shapes that resembled schematic diagrams for machines no one had ever built. On the 3rd day, one of them designation, Obelth collapsed mid-right. His optics dimmed. His hands twitched, and then his body emitted a burst of static loud enough to disrupt Vox channels across 4 sectors. When the noise cleared, the dirt beneath him had fused into glass. He stood up, unassisted, and declared, "The scream is not beneath. It is behind." Then he removed his data spike and drove it into his own spine. Downloading himself into silence, they buried his frame beneath a mound of cables. It pulsed for hours. The choir worked without pause. They dismantled a ruined Chimera engine block and rebuilt it backward, gears spinning into vacuum, pistons moving without fuel. The engine screamed once, then folded in on itself, leaving behind only a scorch mark in the shape of a human skull. One engine seer tried to assist, his servo arms seized. His optic lens turned inward. He spoke one phrase, "I remember too much," and fell into coma. When they opened his databanks, they found ancient code, too ancient, pre-Gothic, half the characters the rest matched fragments from Blackstone vaults. Rumors spread fast. The machine spirit of this planet was not silent. It was listening, not mechanical, not divine, alive and angry. The choir of St. Ferrex began constructing pylons not for communication, but for containment. Thin copper towers linked by razor wire, etched with logic warding patterns. At the center, they erected a single monolith, black as voidstone, humming with vibration no Auspex could chart. Karzan asked what it was. Voxnal responded only once. "It remembers its own design. We are only following." Then came the breach. Not physical, auditory. Every machine within 5 kilometers screamed literally. Lasguns shrieked. Vox units blared garbled wails. Servo skulls cracked mid-air. A tank detonated, without ignition. Its reactor core reduced to molten copper, forming a single rune on the ground. A circuit diagram with no power source. The choir did not flinch. They knelt in unison, palms pressed to earth, and chanted not in Benaric, but in Old Terran dialect. Not a prayer, a plea. The scream passed, but left changes. One medic's augmetic hand began sketching blueprints without instruction, complex diagrams, interwoven with what looked like music. Another trooper's ocular implant displayed images, even when closed maps of underground structures that did not exist. Yet, Voxnal explained nothing, but he installed amplifiers around the hive's fault lines. When activated, they did not transmit, they received. The whispers began, not in ears, in fingers, in teeth. Guardsmen felt it while handling metal teeny pulses, like heartbeat, except not theirs. Messages arrived in breath. One trooper bit into his ration brick and choked on a data shard containing coordinates and instructions to sabotage a nearby reactor before it activated. He did. The reactor was empty, but its ignition would have caused a chain reaction through the choir's pylons. Somehow, it had known. Then came the division. Some claimed the machine spirit trapped below was a relic damaged, malfunctioning, begging to be released from its own corrupted loop. Others insisted it had already escaped, that what screamed now was not imprisoned, but remembered, echoing outward to reclaim the pattern of its former self. The choir did not debate, they recorded every word, every action. One priest, label 6, tore out his own Vox grill and replaced it with a rotating lens. He stopped speaking altogether. But when placed near any cogitator, the screen displayed one line of code. St. Ferrex did not ascend. He rebooted. Heretical. Unclear. The Inquisition had not responded. Perhaps they couldn't. Karzan stood at the edge of their last rite. The choir gathered in a circle, humming in harmonic triads. Above them, the pylons pulsed with light, every strobe aligning with the pulse in his chest. He felt no fear, only awe, not of power, but of design. He realized, then, that fear came from randomness, and this was ordered, just not by anything that had ever been human. One of the choir approached. Him, unarmed, barefooted. The circuitry on his skin glowed dim white. He extended a hand. In it, a fragment of polished alloy, etched with a spiral sigil. "You were always part of the circuit," he said. "We are just correcting your path." Carson took it, and for one impossible second, he heard a machine breathe. The box arrived on schedule. No escort, no stamp, no identifier, just a plascrete crate set at the foot of supply point Gamma, condensation beating across its surface as though it had been cold once, or perhaps always. The quartermaster ran the scans. Clean, no warp taint, no known toxins. The packaging was standard, brown, plastifoil sealed units, marked with barcoded strings. Labels indicated macronutrient breakdown, caloric density, and regimental allocation. Nothing out of place, nothing new, except they hadn't requisitioned it. It wasn't a concern. Troopers had been fighting on recirculated paste for weak stick, metallic gel that clung to the teeth and reeked faintly of rusted spoon. The idea of something different, something sealed, was welcomed. The officers gave the nod. Distribution commenced. Karzan didn't need his immediately. He was tired. Too much movement. Too much static on the Vox, and too many shifts with half-muttered orders that felt more like ritual than strategy. He sat on the trench edge that night, opened the ration by habit, and brought it to his lips without thought. The moment the gel touched his tongue, the world slowed. Not because of flavor. There was no flavor. Not really. It tasted like protein mass, like nutrient-thickened paste, like fuel engineered for war. But underneath, like dust hidden in the cracks of an heirloom, there was something else. It tasted like Laria. He hadn't spoken her name in years. Not since deployment. Not since that tear-streaked farewell on the launch platform where he'd promised something impossible. And yet it was there, plain as any memory. Her breath against his neck, her hair in the barrack light, the way she whispered his name just once, like it hurt. He spat the food out instantly, stared at the packet, rubbed the back of his tongue. It made no sense. He turned to the trooper next to him. "Merrick, already mid-chew. You feel that?" Merrick didn't answer. He was staring straight ahead, jaw frozen, eyes wide. The paste dripped from his lips as he choked, not on food, but on recognition. He dropped the ration, fell to his knees, hands shaking. Then he said, "I just remembered being born." The squad didn't move. Some chuckled, confused, but no one mocked, because they felt it too, a heaviness, a density in the air, like static before lightning. One by one, they tasted the gel, and one by one, they stopped eating. It was never the same memory. For Trell, it was her mother's funeral, except she had never known her mother. For Havoc, it was the smell of a childhood room that didn't exist in any Habunet schematics. For Dren, it was the name of a man he'd never met, and yet loved deeply. The Medicae were called. They ran tests, composition on standard ration makeup, Polymorphic and nutrient slurry with minor taste enhancements. No foreign matter. No psychic residue. No known pattern of influence. They tried to replicate the results. They couldn't. The opened packs deteriorated into gray mush within hours, losing all memory trigger effect. The untouched ones retained their potency, so they locked them up, but the dream started. Anyway, Karzan woke screaming 3 nights in a row. Not from nightmare. From memory. Real memory. Too vivid to be fiction. He remembered holding someone's hand under the wreckage of a ruined basilica. Remembered the shape of a voice calling his name through burning snow. The problem was, he'd never been in a basilica. Never seen snow. But he could still feel the warmth of that hand, calloused and trembling. Fingers interlaced like wires. Others reported worse. One trooper stopped speaking entirely, carving names into his armor with his own teeth. Another tried to eat the ration again and was found convulsing, blood leaking from his nose, whispering coordinates to a system that didn't exist on any chart. Then came the writing. The ration boxes began to change. First subtly, a misplaced glyph, a repeated number. Then, more overtly handwritten notes scrawled across the foil. Not from supply staff. Not from anyone. One message read, "I still remember you." Another, "Why did you leave me in the snow?" A third bore, a child's handwriting. "Come back." Command tried to purge the shipment. Fire didn't touch it. Melted down, the packets returned, the next day reformed, resealed, redistributed. Each soldier received one, regardless of their rank or request. It became ritual. Every morning, a ration on their cot. Some unopened, some licked clean. No one admitted eating them. Karzan cracked a pack on the 4th day. Inside, instead of paste, he found a single lock of hair, black, coarse, wrapped around a nail, carved with the aquila. No blood, just the faint smell of burned lavender, scent he associated with nothing, yet brought tears instantly. He buried it. That night, he dreamt of digging. Some began trading them, like relics, like confessions. You could swap a memory, lose one, gain one. It was never safe, but it was clarifying. A man who'd never known fear chewed 1/2 pack and spent 2 hours weeping. Not from weakness, from understanding, he said, simply. Now I know why they scream. A priest attempted to sanctify them. His blessing echoed backward. The echo answered with a prayer no one had taught him. He tore off his stole and declared, "These are the Eucharist of the forgotten." The rations began to multiply. 1 pack left overnight would become 2. Left untouched, they tripled. If you spoke over them, they turned to dust. If you whispered a name, the next one tasted like that name. But if the name had no meaning to you, it turned sour, bitter, like oil over teeth. Guardsmen began to keep them, not to eat, to feel, like relics of themselves left behind in a life not quite lived. One man broke down after touching one and said, "I think I had a brother." No one had ever heard him speak of family. Then came the final ration, unmarked, smooth, weightless, Karsen, opened it alone. Inside was no paste, no hair, no message, only sound. A single whisper, not into his ears, but into his mind. She waited. He dropped the pack, and for the first time since deployment, he remembered what she smelled like. It began with a hush, not silence, not calm, but the sharp, anticipatory stillness of breath held too long. The air tightened. Static climbed the skin like frost. Birds, those strange red-eyed things that had nested in the eaves of the trench, scaffolds vent. Then the first droplet lifted. Not fell, lifted. Straight from the ground, bead by bead, slowly at first, defying gravity, like a mistake in physics made visible. Dirt moistened and dried in the same instant. Pools reversed. The surface shimmered like a mirror, touched by wind. The first to speak was a Vox operator, half asleep against his cum stack. Reins going backward, he said, voice cracked with disbelief. No one laughed. They all saw it. The droplets gained speed, faster, denser, rising in thick columns like steam reversed. Mud peeled away from boots. Ash from fire pits streamed upward in long ribbons. The sky above didn't blacken, it brightened, pale and white, like a lens flaring before blindness. The rain wasn't water. Not fully. It carried heat, but didn't burn instantly. It left no wound. Just pain, delayed, insistent. Karzan stepped into it by accident. The sting was minor, an insect bite, no more. But when he looked down, his left pauldron bore a new mark, an arc of sigils he couldn't read. Etched as if by laser, burned deep into the ceramite, without melting it. He wiped at it. It didn't fade. It shimmered when the rain touched it again, glowing faint amber, like cooling metal. Other guardsmen found marks too. No pattern, no repetition. Some bore symbols, others words. One bore a face not his own, but one eerily similar, with eyes blacked out and mouth sewn shut. It stared back at him from his thigh plate. He tried to carve it off. The knife shattered. Within hours, the chaplains emerged, robes soaked from below the hem up. They declared it divine correction, proof that the Emperor's gaze had turned inward upon his sons. That scene's too long, hidden in trench muck, had risen with the storm to be seen. One knelt beneath the upward deluge and wept blood. Another screamed the canticles of illumination until his voice cracked and his throat bled scripture. The Inginziers disagreed. They said the planet's magnetic poles had fractured. That solar wind interference, exacerbated by residual warp pressure, had reversed atmospheric vectors. But even as they spoke, their mechadendrites curled reflexively away from the rain, and sparks danced across their augmetic limbs like static, looking for a shape. Then came the inscriptions. It was subtle at first, lines, curves, indentations in armor and flesh alike. Not cuts, not scars, not bruises, marks, symbols shaped from pain without trauma. One guardsman screamed mid-patrol, ripped open his flak vest, and revealed a chest full of liturgy he didn't know he'd memorized. The words glowed as rain traced them upward, syllable by syllable, until his whole torso pulsed like an illuminated manuscript. Karzan watched another trooper go still as water rose around him. When it touched his jaw, his head snapped back, eyes rolled white, and from his throat came a sound no voice box should have produced. Not a scream, not a chant, something deeper, a remembering. He collapsed seconds later, twitching, face blank. He spoke nothing afterward, but his eyes were never dry again. The phenomenon didn't stop. Day after day, it returned, sometimes for minutes, sometimes hours. Never from clouds, always from below, pulled upward like a prayer to long unanswered. It soaked trenches from underneath, rising through soil, seeping from cracks in ferrocrete, running up the walls of bunkers like veins, seeking hearts. It carved through dirt and gear alike. It turned the battlefield into a script written in fluid and flesh. The marks never faded, even when washed, even when burned, and they began to respond. One trooper fell during a firefight, bullet to the gut, but the mark across his stomach, 3 slashes, forming a crooked sigil, flared as the rain began to rise. He stood again, whole, pale, silent. He continued to fight, but didn't speak for 2 days. When asked what happened, he merely said, "It read me," and it rewrote the wound. Others weren't so lucky. Another was caught in a concentrated updraft. His body levitated, not violently, slowly, peacefully, but when he reached 3 meters above ground, he ignited. Blood turned to flame without smoke. His armor dropped empty, still steaming. Inside his helmet, the only trace was a single drop of silver liquid shaped like an eye. Chaplains doubled down, called it judgment, proof that the Emperor walked among them, not in form, but in filter, that the storm sorted worth from waste. Some soldiers believed, Some fell to their knees in each storm, arms raised, mouths open. Others hid, wrapped themselves in tarp and hope, hiding in crevices, whispering names they thought long forgotten. But the rain found them anyway. Medicae stopped treating burns. There were no burns, only transformations. Hands that shook before a storm now steadied. Eyes that once blurred found clarity, but some suffered inversions. One man could no longer see faces, only armor. Another claimed he had lost all memory of his name, but knew the names of everyone else. Even the dead weren't immune. The massed grave behind Command Post Delta began to shimmer during one storm. Dirt lifted. Bones rose. Not fully, not violently. Just fragments, fingers, jawbones, ribs surfacing, as if trying to breathe. No one dared rebury them. They built a fence. A low one. It didn't help. The next night, the fence had inscriptions on it. New ones, matching those on the soldiers' armor. Carson stopped keeping his journal. The ink wouldn't stick. The pages ran dry, but every time he opened the cover, a new line appeared. Not in his hand, never legible, but always familiar. He once saw a sentence form as the rain struck the page. What fights through you, lives in you. He closed the book, never opened it again. Eventually, they stopped asking why. The rain wasn't weather. It was message, not prophecy, not punishment, presence. And when it lifted each time, the world looked unchanged. But everyone who had stood in it knew something had seen them and chosen to remember. The first patrol didn't return. That in itself wasn't unusual. Attrition was constant, terrain unstable, and comms unreliable at best. But when the second patrol vanished in the same route, under clear Vox cover, with a full beacon kit, they took notice. Not alarm, not yet, but notice. A small change in posture. Helmets remained on indoors. Las guns were cradled even off-duty. Silence became heavier in the mess, words chosen more carefully, as if the air had become a listener. Then the armor returned. Not the soldiers. Just the armor, set down carefully along the trench wall, arranged in a neat row. 5 suits, cleaned, undamaged, helmets sealed. Inside, nothing. No blood, no viscera, no sign of struggle. One trooper's rebreather still clicked, as if filtering breath. The Auspex scan revealed trace bioelectric residue, not decayed, not fresh, suspended. Like someone had paused inside the suit and simply walked away without opening it. No tracks, no drag marks. Just 5 sets of boots pointed east, their shadows still etched in the dirt, longer than they should be. Wrong angle, no source. Command locked down all outbound patrols. But that night, the fog crawled in again, thicker than before, slow and deliberate. It didn't obscure sight, it filtered it. Shapes moved within, not quickly, not chaotically, just with intent. Like predators that didn't need to run because they'd already been watching long enough to know exactly when to strike. But no one was struck, no bodies were ever found, only armor. One set at a time. Every morning, clean, folded, set beside the chapel entrance or outside command. Always intact, always marked with a new symbol scorched into the plating. Irregular at first, then patterned, like language. A litany spoken in absence. The chaplains responded as they always had, with ritual. But the sermons changed. No longer about the emperor's gaze or the sanctity of duty. Now, they preached emptiness. About things that could not be seen, only known. About battles fought without adversaries, victories without wounds. One began every sermon with the same phrase, "Blessed are they who are not here." Troopers listened, or pretended to. Some stopped asking who was missing, because the names never matched the logs. People vanished who were never assigned, entire squads that no one remembered deploying. One medic swore she'd treated a gunner named Dalson, described his voice, his injury, his laugh, but his bunk was always empty. His name was not in the manifest. No one had ever met him, so they stopped trying to remember the missing and began honoring them instead. Offerings started small: spent charge packs, tin icons, a strip of cloth bearing regimental colors tied to a beam beside the trench wall. Then came the carvings. Scratches along the trench boards, curves, circles, long tapering lines like fingers wrapped in chains. One soldier tied a bootlace around a broken las rifle, left it beneath the stars, and said nothing. The next day, the lace was gone. The las rifle was intact. No one asked how. Whatever was out there didn't kill for need. It didn't burn. It didn't scream. It collected, softly, like dusk, and so the rituals grew. The chaplains blessed empty armor, placed candles inside sealed helmets, chanted to the spaces between sentences. They wrote new litanies hymns that didn't invoke the Emperor's light, but his echo. The belief that even the God Emperor knew what it meant to be watched by something he could not name. And the men began to believe. Not out of madness, out of necessity. Because if the shadows could take without pain, if the missing left no struggle, only symbols, if the enemy never appeared but always arrived, then perhaps it wasn't war anymore. Perhaps it was worship. Curzon felt it worst when he stood alone. Not fear, not dread, presence. The kind of weight in the lungs that made breath feel like intrusion. He began muttering when he walked, unconsciously, just to fill the air. Words that had no syntax. Just syllables to push back the quiet. One night, he recited a phrase he didn't know. Let not the faceless walk alone. He stopped, wrote it down, compared it to the trench carving. It matched others started reporting the same, words slipping into their mouths, hands sketching shapes on bedrolls, dirt, flak armor. No instruction, no orders, just repetition, like something beneath language pressing upward through the cracks. One morning, they found a soldier standing at the trench edge, armor removed, skin unmarked, head bowed. He didn't move. When approached, he turned, smiled, and said, "I am already gone." He collapsed, still breathing, still warm, but his eyes saw nothing, and his shadow didn't match his shape. They left him there. A week later, 4 more disappeared. No alarm, no blood, just gear stacked neatly in their bunks, and a message carved into the wall behind them. "Thank you for not looking." Comm's logs showed no outgoing signals. Surveillance failed each time motion was detected beyond the wire. The auspex would freeze, then display a single glyph, a circle split into 5 curved lines, like fingers reaching in. Always the same, always flickering, always warm. The chaplains called a mass rite, no sermon, just silence. Each soldier lit a candle and placed it in the center of the trench. By nightfall, hundreds glowed like stars that had come down to kneel. When the fog returned, it did not extinguish them. It bowed. Curzon stayed awake through the watch, not out of fear, out of respect. The trench felt heavier than usual, but not oppressive, anchored, grounded by the weight of so many unsaid names. When he finally slept, he dreamed not of the war, or of her, or of dying. He dreamed of armor, empty, marching without step, shadows wrapped around forms that didn't need flesh. They weren't coming for him, they were already him. And when he woke, he found a symbol burned into the inside of his helmet. The same 5-lined circle. Still warm. He didn't scrub it off. He whispered a thank you. They didn't notice at first. The change was subtle. A bend in the trench that hadn't been there yesterday. A junction that now led nowhere. A storage depot listed on every datasheet as east of the command post, but found instead behind it. Sunk halfway into the clay like it had grown tired of remembering where it belonged. At first, they blamed fatigue. War wears the mind thin. Shifts blur. Fog confuses. No one trusted their senses completely, and trust is what fills the gaps. But when 2 entire units failed to rendezvous at supply node, Delta site clearly marked, visibly reinforced, and previously visited dozens of times, they began to suspect more than simple exhaustion. Karzan was among the recovery team. They followed standard patrol routes, checking each landmark against the map. But the map lied, or the world did. The path curved inward where it should have opened. Trees appeared in the blast zone, where no vegetation had ever grown. The backup beacon they deployed at the last marker broadcast fine, yet the terrain insisted it was in the wrong place. Karzan stared at it for 10 minutes. The air shimmered around it like a mirage, but touching it confirmed it was real. He could feel the metal, but not believe it. The recon team split and regrouped, twice. Each time, the distance between them grew. One squad swore they walked in a straight line yet returned to the same broken stairwell 3 separate times. The staircase hadn't led anywhere. It hadn't even been part of the trench system. The map had said otherwise. By the 3rd day, Command issued new copies, fresh printouts, satellite adjusted. They were distributed in sealed packets. They were wrong too. Entire sectors marked with accurate coordinates now showed structures that no longer existed, or worse, never had. One trooper followed a route to a resupply bunker labeled Gamma 6. He found it, door locked. Inside, no supplies. Just a single chair facing a mirror, and a message painted on the wall behind it. You were not supposed to find this again. He never spoke after that. Commissar Eluin ordered a full audit. Troop positions were verified, Vox pings confirmed. Uzbek scans returned consistent readings, but movement through the terrain contradicted everything. It was as if the land shifted when not seen. Buildings twisted behind closed eyes. Angles refused to stay Euclidean. One trench, measured at 75 meters by 10, was found the next day to be a perfect circle dug into its own beginning. Then came the incident with cartographist Magellan. Magellan had charted the sector for 6 months. He was meticulous, unassuming, not prone to exaggeration. But when his newest maps were reviewed, Command accused him of sedition. His updated version of the battlefield included structures not in any Imperial record, towers shaped like fingers, rivers flowing upward, tunnels that looped into themselves. One section bore a massive black square labeled simply, "Not us." They questioned him for 7 hours. He refused to renounce his work. He claimed he hadn't drawn the maps. He'd copied them. From what, he wouldn't say. Said the land writes itself when you're quiet. Eluin declared him compromised. Shot him cleanly through the head. The guards watched in silence. 2 days later, Magellan returned, alive, changed. He walked calmly into the command tent, wearing the same uniform, holding no weapons. His face was his, but different. Hair gray, eyes sunken, wrinkles cut deeper than a man of his years could earn in 2 days. He said nothing, simply laid down a new map on the strategy table and whispered, "This one won't lie." Then he collapsed. Heart stopped. His fingers were burned in circular patterns. The map was unlike any they'd seen. It didn't display roads or trenches. It showed paths, wounds in the earth marked with lines of descent, as if the soil itself had been charted not in elevation, but emotion. Karzan ran his hand across it. He felt dizzy. Images pressed against his mind. A cathedral submerged in sand, a hallway made of ribs, a watchtower screaming silently into the sky. No one else touched it after that. Command buried Magellan again. This time with fire. Navigation patrols tripled. Memory drills were reinstated. Troopers were ordered to walk routes twice before trusting their direction. It didn't help. A platoon vanished between 2 known trench junctions, recovered days later, sunburned and starved, claiming they'd spent minutes crossing what they thought was a 1-hour march. Their clocks read 7 minutes. Their boots had worn through. One soldier's timepiece was 20 years behind, another's was 2 days ahead, and counting upward too fast to follow. Some began using scent markers, grease, incense, blood to track their movement, but even those turned unreliable. One squad followed a trail of incense they'd laid hours earlier, only to arrive at a room they hadn't built, filled with gear they'd never seen, each piece labeled with their own names. The chaplains declared it sacred disorientation, proof that faith alone could guide the soul through uncertain terrain. That maps were prideful, that memory was a crutch meant to be broken. They preached about the reforging of thought, a doctrine where the emperor no longer led with direction, but with dislocation. One began carrying a blank slate as his guide, claiming only the unseen path is righteous. Some soldiers began drawing maps of their own, not of terrain, but of feeling, pages filled with strange loops, emotional markers. One page read, "Fear here, loss here, stillness here, return here only when you're ready." They carried these instead of orders. One night, Karzan followed a tunnel he swore he'd walked every day. It ended in a stone arch that shouldn't have been there. Beyond it, a sky he didn't recognize, crimson, heavy, full of hanging shapes that pulsed like heartbeats. He stepped back. The arch was gone. Behind him, the trench was wider than before. The stars were wrong, but he was still alive, still here. He checked his map. It was blank. He smiled, because now, at least, it was honest. The Vox should have been silent. It was past third rotation, the fog hung thick, and no patrols were scheduled. Yet somewhere between sleep and readiness, the old field unit coughed to life with broken syntax, stuttering static, a shuffle of breath against the hiss. Karzan didn't notice it at first. The voice came low, familiar, human, a woman's voice, wavering between memory and malfunction. It said his name, not rank, not call sign, not code. His name. No one had used it in months, not since the deployment, not since the trench became more home than anything he remembered leaving. He approached the Vox set, its rust-flaked housing blinking faint amber. The channel wasn't listed. The panel read. The frequency display spun wildly. The voice repeated, "Shale, my son." It stopped his heart. Not from fear, from recognition. He knew that voice, burned into his earliest years. A memory of warmth long buried under boot soil and blood. The exact cadence, tone, even the tremble in syllables like her breath still ran thin in her chest. His mother had died on Cadia. The bombardment, the fall. He'd received confirmation through Munitorum channels. He'd seen the list. Her name, cold and final, etched among millions in a column that reached the page's end. There'd been no body, just an absence in the world where once there had been her. And yet, here she was whispering across broken airwaves. He called others over, Havoc Dren, even the tech priest. They listened. The voice didn't change, didn't distort, just repeated itself. "Shale, come home." A pause, then a set of coordinates, repeated 3 times. No sector designator, just numbers. Longitudes that didn't match any map they had. The system didn't recognize them, but Karzan did. Not with memory, with instinct, because he'd dreamed them. The previous night, and the one before that. Numbers etched into frost, carved into bunker walls, whispered in trenchant hallucinations when his eyes slipped closed. They matched perfectly. He hadn't told anyone, hadn't dared. But now, here they were spoken in her voice. The tech priest scanned the signal. No origin, no modulation signature. The frequency was marked unbound, a classification reserved for unregulated echoes waveforms that traveled through Vox space without tether. Most were dismissed as static anomalies. But this one carried form, identity. It should not exist. The commissar declared it psyker interference, possible Xenos trickery. Karzan was ordered to submit for mental screening. He complied, passed every test. No warp residue, no nodomunchiki taint. no signs of suggestion. The voice still came the next night. Same time, same words. But this time, it added something new. You forgot the stars we counted, the window, the wind, and Karzan remembered. A childhood bunk beneath a cracked glass ceiling, her voice counting constellations, his breath fogging the pain, the cold, the silence, the safety. Things he hadn't thought of in years, not since Cadia broke apart and turned memory into myth. The others began receiving messages to Dot, not their mothers, not anyone they could name, but voices, familiar, personal. One soldier heard the voice of a brother lost during a crash on a Kyros. Another received instructions in the cadence of a drill sergeant, 2 decades dead. Each message included coordinates. Each location was wrong, impossible placements across terrain they had already patrolled. Bunkers that didn't exist. Hills that never rose. Paths through structures that had no doors. Some ignored them, but others went, and some returned. Changed, not visibly, not violently, but changed, calmer, quieter, not empty, but full. They spoke little, ate less, slept with eyes half open, staring into nothing with a peace no battlefield should afford. One built a shrine in a corner of the trench wall. No iconography, just a slab of vox metal etched with the phrase, "The dead remember what we forgot." Others didn't return at all. Karzan didn't go. Not immediately. He recorded the message, played it back, had it analyzed, same result. No origin, no error, pure vox, real voice. Eventually, the chaplains entered the discussion. They claimed the voices were tests, echoes of temptation. They revised the daily litany to include a new line, "Ignore the signal. Faith requires deafness to all, but him." But soldiers stopped reciting that line, silently, united because even the chaplains heard things. One broke down, mid-sermon sobbing. "She told me I was right," he said. "She told me the prayers mattered." When asked who she was, he said only, "The one I left behind." She waited. The next day, he was found sitting atop the Vox Tower, whispering into the dish. The Vox signals increased, each night, more precise. Now, with timetables, weather, emotional tones. Some even responded to direct questions. One soldier asked, "Are you really my father?" The voice said, "No, but I remember what it felt like to hold you." The guardsmen began leaving offerings again, this time beside the Vox arrays. Spent packs, half-written letters, teeth, things they no longer needed. Things they thought might make them heard in return. Karzan held out as long as he could, but the voice never stopped. It grew softer, closer. Eventually, he stopped asking how. He just listened. And then one night, she said something new. "I'm not calling you back. I'm calling you forward." A shift. The tone sharpened. The coordinates changed. Different location. Still non-existent. But, when cross-referenced with Maglin's forbidden map, the one retrieved from his aged corpse, they matched. Exactly. A bunker. Unmarked, buried, unnamed. A path hidden in narrative coordinates. Follow what you believe, not what you remember. Karzan took his rifle, his tags, his silence. He went. The fog parted for him. He returned 3 days later. He said nothing, but every night afterward, he took Vox watch. He never recorded what he heard, but he always smiled, and when asked what the voice said, that finally made him go, he answered, "She didn't ask me to come home. She asked me to bring home with me the ruins of Outpost." Varnak stood like an open wound in the dust. Long-abandoned walls slumped under the weight of time, reinforced with generations of patchwork, plating, and bone-colored insulation stitched from unknown fabric. Carson's unit was deployed there for rest and resupply. That was the official line. Unofficially, it was to investigate a looped signal and automated broadcast pulsing outward from its command vox. Unbroken, unacknowledged, uninterrupted for 9 standard years. They heard the scream before they saw the outpost. It came at exactly 0700, on the dot. A single burst. Human. Full-throated. Agonized. Not drawn out. Not layered with static. Just one, pure, rupturing sound. Then silence. It repeated every day. The scream was not identical. Sometimes it rose with a hitch in the lungs. Other times it cracked halfway through. Once it was cut off mid-cry by what sounded like a wet impact. But it was always one voice. Singular. Singularly alone. No one knew whose dot inside Varnak things were. Operational, in the most unnatural sense of the word. The defenses were manned. Turrets functional. Auspex calibrated. Generators churned with rhythmic thrum. The garrison, if they could still be called that, stood in perfect formation. Uniforms crisp, boots polished, eyes bloodshot. They greeted Carson's squad without expression, offering nothing but a sharp nod and the same phrase. Orders still in effect. There had been no enemy movement in the sector for over 4 years. The last hostile contact recorded in the region was a minor Xeno incursion repelled within hours, but no one had told the garrison, or if they had, they hadn't listened. They lived by the original directive: hold outpost, Varnak, await reinforcements, deny all enemy movement, maintain radio silence unless given. Command grade override. Override codes had been issued. 3 years ago, they had been received, recorded, and discarded. When questioned, the garrison's commander, a gaunt figure named Jor-El, with skin like parchment and a rebreather permanently fused to his throat, simply replied, "False orders." Voice print corrupted. Syntax unfaithful. He turned and walked away. One of his men, more blunt, said, "If the war was over, we'd be dead." Carson's team was allowed to stay, given quarters, rations, ammunition, no access to the Vox room, no access to archives, no access to the chapel. There were no priests stationed. The chapel doors were sealed from the inside. No one claimed the scream. The following morning, at 0700, the scream came again. Sharper this time, like it tore itself free of a mouth that no longer knew how to shape agony. Carson's squad all stopped eating. No one looked at each other. It wasn't a sound to be analyzed. It was declared, like something in the garrison had been given its one daily moment too. Remember, it was alive. Jor-El called it roll call. Every member of the garrison had their own theories. None shared them aloud. One trooper, older than his posted file claimed, whispered to Carson in the corridor, "We've all thought it was us, at least once. Sometimes I feel it in my throat before it starts." He swallowed. "I don't sleep facing the Vox room anymore." When asked why they didn't investigate the source, he simply said, "You don't open the wound that keeps you standing." The Vox relay was sealed, not by locks or code, by belief. Ritualized wiring, candles burned to nut, a purity seal affixed with bone fragments, not wax. No sigil from the ecclesiarchy, just a single sentence etched across the door in carved ferrosteel: orders are not replaced. They are fulfilled, or they are failure. The command structure remained rigid. Timetables followed. Patrols conducted like clockwork. But all logic had rotted out from beneath it. One patrol circled a trench long since collapsed, still calling out coordinates that hadn't matched for years. Another unit held fire drills at midnight, cycling through positions for enemies no one could name. Carson watched one soldier shout a target code into the fog, then lower his weapon and whisper, "I know," into the barrel. He didn't shoot. He just stood there, waiting for orders. Every few days a new directive would pulse through the network. High command, verified encryption, verified tone print. The garrison didn't even read them. When asked, Commander Jor-El smiled faintly beneath his rebreather. "We've learned not to trust new words. Too many of them came late, or wrong, or from mouths that didn't know us." He paused. "We remember who gave the first orders. We remember his voice, his tone, his silence. Everything since has been static in the blood. By the 6th day, Carson's squad was fraying. Not from stress, from dissonance. Their world operated on cause and effect, on command and execution. But here, logic had ossified into liturgy. The theater of war still running its lines long after the audience had left. Dren stopped shaving. Trell began recording the scream each morning and sleeping to it at night. Havoc said he was starting to recognize the rhythm in it, like syllables half swallowed, like someone trying to say something but forced to scream instead. Then came the moment no one could explain. A new soldier appeared. No one had seen him arrive. No transport. No introduction. He was simply there, standing in the commissary queue. Uniform pristine, badge unscanned. When questioned, he responded with, "Reporting for rotation, sir." His name wasn't on any roster that his face matched, no archive, but he had orders, signed, stamped, old, from a general who had died 6 years prior. They let him stay, not because they trusted him, but because he fit. He knew the drill, knew the steps, recited the old battle hymns before eating, said the war is not over until we are over. Every night before rest cycle, he screamed at 0700 on the 8th day. They heard it. Clearly this time, it wasn't pain, it was memory, forced through the throat like blood through a clogged artery. And when it stopped, the silence felt like defeat. Carson's squad departed the next day. No one tried to stop them. The garrison simply nodded. No goodbyes. Only one final phrase from Commander Jor-El, spoken through Vox. "If your orders change, remember who sent the first ones." The road back was straight, too straight, longer than it should have been, and though they left Varnak behind at 0700 sharp, the scream followed them for 3 more days. Carson never traced its source. He just listened and wondered when his orders would end. They said it was a clean hit, a lasbolt through the thigh right above the greave, low enough to miss the artery, high enough to drop him. Trooper Island fell hard during a fog sweep northeast of Echo Trench. The blast cauterized on entry, as it always did, but he refused even to scream. He just stared at the wound, silent, breathing slow, like he was listening to it. At first, no one noticed. Wounds are common. Pain is part of the pattern. The Medicaid made note, marked him as not, left a reminder tag on his bunk. The next morning, the tag was gone, replaced by a strip of paper bearing 6 words, handwritten in black ink. "You are not ready to heal." Island did not return to the infirmary. The wound did not fester. It did not scab. It did not heal. It pulsed, not visibly, but rhythmically. Guardsmen reported hearing faint murmurs at night, like breath or a chant. When Island slept, his body twitched in time with it, as if the wound itself was dreaming. By the 3rd day, he began kneeling before it, at first, in private, then, without shame, fully armored, hands clasped, head bowed over his leg like a man in confession, not begging, adoring, his face calm. Still, Medicaids attempted to intervene. He refused. "It's not an injury," he said. "It's a revelation." They tried to sedate him. The syringe snapped. The Medicaid who tried left the next day, citing migraines and blurred vision. He claimed the wound whispered something into his thoughts, and he wasn't worthy to remember it. Island was reassigned to trench maintenance. He never left his cot. The wound moved, not in the flesh, in location. One morning, it was in his thigh. By evening, his abdomen. No blood trail, no signs of surgery. Just a smooth, cauterized hole, like the skin itself invited the mark inward. He said nothing, but the look on his face changed. Not madness, not bliss, just clarity. Others began to notice. Ammunition officers, Vox techs, even a chaplain. They came one by one, quietly, to watch. No one spoke. They simply stood around Island, watching the way he breathed, watching the pulse of the flesh around the wound. It was mesmerizing, subtle, steady, like a heartbeat, but slower, more deliberate. And sometimes, if the light hit just right, they swore they could see something moving beneath the skin. Not infection, instruction. Then the story started. One guardsman claimed he saw the bolt that made the wound, not the physical one, the truth inside it. He described a sliver of light, too thin for matter, too slow for speed. Said it wasn't a projectile, but a command, not a message, a reminder that pain wasn't punishment. It was translation. Another said he touched the wound and heard music. Island never confirmed. He simply opened his eyes and said, "Now you know." The ritual spread. A small group formed. They called themselves the Witnessed. Not a cult, not a rebellion, just observers. They came to sit near Island. No words, no ceremony, just presence. Some stayed minutes, some stayed hours. Most left changed. They walked straighter, aimed cleaner, slept without dreaming. The chaplains investigated. One tried to recite the litany of purity beside Island's cat. Halfway through, his voice cracked. He clutched his throat, fell to his knees, vomited a piece of metal shaped like a half-melted aquila. He wept, not from pain, from understanding. He joined the Witnessed. The wound deepened, not wider, not longer, just inward. Karzan saw it once, during ration detail. Island's shirt slipped. The edges of the wound shimmered, not scar tissue, not infection, like heat distortion across a lens of memory. It looked deeper than the body, as if it tunneled down into something past flesh, past bone, into history. Island began speaking during sleep, not words, not screams, phrases in a cadence not his own. Bolt and breath are one, aim and prayer indistinct. Inside the strike, the seed. Inside the seed, the pattern. The words changed nightly, always rhythmic, always impossible to remember after hearing. But one phrase stayed consistent: "It only hurts if you resist." One soldier tried to replicate the wound, took a last blade to his arm, failed. The cut healed, infected, scarred. Nothing happened. No pulse, no voice, just pain. He apologized, then begged forgiveness from Island's cat. Island never acknowledged him, because by then, Island no longer moved. The wound had reached his chest. He was still breathing, still eating, when fed, but never spoke again. The Witnessed kept vigil. At night, they chanted not in unison, but in rhythm, as if each body was reading the wound in its own dialect. One day, a guardsman stood up after 3 hours of silence and fired 3 shots into the air. All struck a hawk, drifting through the fog. No one had seen it until it fell. He said, "The bolts knew," then sat down again. Command ordered dispersal, declared the ritual unauthorized, threatened executions. The officers sent to enforce the order returned silent, pale eyes hollow. They said nothing. They simply wrote the phrase, "I saw it open," onto their bunk walls. No further action was taken. The wound began to spread, not to other bodies, to the trench. Small burns appeared along the ferrocrete walls, identical in shape to Island's wound. Soldiers reported dreams of trenches bleeding. Some woke with pressure in their chests, like something had marked them from within. No blood, no injury, just presence. Island's cat was moved, not by human hands. It was found 10 meters from its original position, untouched, with drag marks that made no sense. 5 perfect circles trailing from the feet, not backward, but outward, like the trench itself had moved to accommodate. Then came the fire. A flamer malfunctioned. It ignited without trigger, blasting upward into the sky for 7 seconds. No damage, no casualties, just a single mark burned into the soil, the shape of Island's wound. now radiating outward in perfect symmetry. No one cleaned. It thought they placed candles around it. The witness gathered. They said nothing, but all of them smiled. Not with joy, with certainty. Because whatever the wound had once been an accident, an injury. A point of paint was now a mouth, and the mouth was speaking, and the flesh was listening. No one remembered when they arrived. There was no recorded drop. New requisition, no formal request logged in the Munitorum system. They were simply their Medicate unit, Omega-30 and fully outfitted, housed in a prefabricated surgical dome that had not existed the day before. It bore no insignia beyond a white spiral printed on a field of gray. No aquila, no regimental stamp, no mechanicus verification. Just the spiral. Their arrival was not questioned, because from the moment they activated their equipment, the screaming stopped. Carson heard the silence first. The trench had lived with pain for so long that its absence was startling. No moaning from the wounded, no bone saws shrieking through the fog, only the soft sound of chimes, thin, glassy notes drifting from the Medicate dome in irregular patterns. No melody, just pulse, like breath-made music. The first man treated under Omega-13 walked again in less than an hour. His leg had been shattered, splintered beyond standard reconstruction, yet when he emerged, he bore no limp, no memory of the injury, only a band of skin across his thigh, branded with a delicate sigil, circular, inkless, as if burned into him by light. The branding became routine. Every patient, every wound, treated swiftly, efficiently, wordlessly, and each left with a sigil, different each time, always placed over unbroken skin. The Medicae never spoke individually. They spoke in unison, not like recitation, like rhythm. Their voices matched breath, pitch, and timing exactly. Even when answering multiple questions from multiple directions, their tone never broke. Questions about their training were deflected. Questions about the sigils ignored. Questions about sleep were answered simply. We do not pause function. They did not blink often. They did not eat. They worked in 12-hour rotations without stopping, then stood perfectly still until the next began. The surgical area was unlike anything Carson had seen. Sterilized not by chemical, but by incense. Thick gray plumes rolled through the tents before every procedure, stinging the eyes, burning the nose. It carried a scent both acrid and sweet, something like old parchment dipped in antiseptic, and it lingered on the skin long after leaving the dome. Some soldiers refused treatment at first, then they saw the results. A man with a punctured lung came out humming. Another, blind from shrapnel, emerged weeping, not from pain, but from the return of sight. One trooper suffered from memory erosion after prolonged exposure to Vox ghost frequencies. Omega-13 adjusted him. He returned lucid. To lucid, he began sketching machine diagrams without ever being taught technical drawing. He claimed it came from somewhere in the steam. No one laughed, because he wasn't the only one. Patter emerged. The healed returned, altered, not broken, not disturbed, but aligned, like instruments tuned to a note no one had heard played. Then the branding. Marks began to pulse, nothing visible, but those who bore them claimed they responded when decisions were near tightening with danger, loosening with safety. Some described a faint warmth when lying. Others said they dreamed of sterile corridors filled with iron trees and bloodless hands offering knives wrapped in scripture. The chaplains intervened. They confronted Omega-13 during a morning rite, accused them of deviation, demanded proof of faith in chain of command. The Medicae did not react. They simply responded. All at once, we serve the body. We serve what the body serves. And you do not remember what that is. The chaplains did not return. 3 days later, the Inquisition arrived. Black robes, veiled faces, acolytes, with scorched purity seals and vox tethers that whispered even when cut. The trench held its breath. No one spoke of it aloud, but everyone knew the same truth. When the Inquisition investigates your Medicae, something unholy is suspected. They entered the dome. 6 went in, 3 came out. Their faces were blank, pale, no blood, no bruises, no burns, just silence. They carried no reports, they submitted no findings, they requisitioned nothing. They simply stood beside the dome for 6 hours, unmoving, then departed. One left behind a note carved into the wall with a boot knife. Pain was only the symptom. From that point forward, no one questioned. Omega-13 again, but their influence deepened. The sigils spread, not just on the healed, on walls, on cots, carved into helmets, etched on blades, burned into prayer books. No one admitted placing them, but they appeared, persisted, glowed faintly in low light. Carson found one on the inside of his flak collar. He hadn't worn that collar in weeks. No one else had touched it. When he put it on, he heard something just for a moment. A single phrase spoken directly into his spine. Function without fracture. He didn't remove it again. The Medicae began treating soldiers before injury. They would appear silently at the trench edge, place a hand against a man's shoulder, and whisper a line none could remember afterward. The soldier would nod, kneel, and receive a mark. Those men stopped missing shots, stopped losing blood, stopped speaking in dreams. The fog no longer entered the dome. It curled around it, avoided it, as if the air itself refused proximity. One soldier, delirious with fever, stumbled into the dome during non-rotation hours. He ran out screaming, said he saw mirrors filled with organs, hands that stitched without touching, faces under masks that did not move with words, but breathed sound into bone. Claimed he watched a heart removed, rewritten, and replaced. He was dead before morning 'cause unknown. The autopsy returned nothing. Omega-13 claimed the body, buried it themselves. No rites, no marker, just the sigil, this time etched into the earth above the grave. The next day, wild dogs avoided the area entirely. Omega-13 did not expand. They didn't need to. Their dome remained the same size, same hum, same scent, but more came out of it than ever went in. At night, their silhouettes passed behind the canvas wall stall, upright, steady, like statues taught to walk. Sometimes, their voices leaked through the vents, not speech, chorus. Dozens, hundreds, more than should have fit inside. Carson stopped trying to count, because deep down, he already knew. They weren't healing wounds. They were replacing what could no longer be trusted. They said the ocean swallowed it in silence, that the tides rose not by lunar pull, but command, that no tremor shook the stone, no storm cracked the dome. It simply sank slow and obedient, like a congregation kneeling in unison. One moment, the chapel stood on the cliff's edge, defiant in silhouette. The next, only foam, bubbles, then nothing. But the bells never stopped. They rang every morning at the same hour, 0500 local, for low tones, too high a pause. Then one final note, sharp and distant, like a blade tapped against porcelain. There were no speakers, no vox amplification, no relay towers near enough to fake the sound. Just the sea, still, cold, unbroken. The guardsmen near the coast were the first to hear it. At first, they thought it an echo, a malfunction in their helmet pickups. But soon, they heard it without gear, through soil, through teeth, as if the note had become a nerve. Sergeant Keffer was the first to go down. He stood during the bell call, eyes rolled white, mouth moving without sound. When they reached him, he'd written scripture on his own, skin fingernails gouged into his chest, the shape of the Aquila, inverted and weeping. He spoke only one phrase, below, it forgives. They confined him to an iron coffin. Within hours, he drowned. No breach, no fluid in lungs, but salt water spilled from his mouth in the shape of breath. After that, the prayers changed. Chaplains gathered at dawn, as always, but some began trembling before the bell. Others fell silent entirely, as if their tongues no longer belonged to the words they'd memorized since Schola. The codices slipped. Litanies grew uncertain. Rituals broke mid-motion. One chaplain plunged his Crozius into the sand and declared, "He listens now from beneath." They found him at low tide, body stretched face down on the wet shore, arms outstretched toward the water. There were no footprints, only drag marks his knees, leaving grooves in the sand too deep for any man to crawl without snapping bone. No one removed the Crozius. It began ringing on its own, quiet, but in time with the bells. Soon, troopers reported seeing shapes in the shallows. Not silhouettes, not bodies, postures, rows of bowed heads just below the surface. Too still, too even. They didn't float. They didn't drift. They simply knelt. They wore no armor, no robes. But something gleamed faintly where their hearts would be. Red, gold, and glass. And each had a chain trailing from its back, vanishing deeper into the abyss. Recon squads sent into the surf never returned whole. One came back missing time. They believed they'd been under for 20 minutes. The mission log showed 7 hours. Their skin was waterlogged, wrinkled beyond age. Each bore a bruise around the throat, perfect ring-shaped patterns, like a collar had pressed inwards, then vanished. One spoke in her sleep. "I drowned 3 times. He kissed me back each time." Medicae scans revealed no brain anomalies, only that their blood had shifted salinity, less iron, more sodium. A warning was issued to avoid coastal patrols during 0500-600. It wasn't obeyed, not out of insubordination, but compulsion. The bell called. Men listened. They left trenches mid-meal, stood from beds, dropped tools. Some went barefoot. Some took relics. Some marched in squads, praying aloud in rhythmic chant with words no chaplain had ever taught. Those who returned came back. Different, not visibly. Their armor remained. Their eyes still blinked, but their rituals changed. They refused Promethean blessings. They stopped fearing the fog. One officer tried to reprimand them. The next morning, he awoke coughing water, not choking weeping. His tears ran clear for hours, and his throat rang like a tuning fork when the bells tolled again. They excommunicated him. He walked into the surf that evening, never flinching, as the tide rose past his helmet. His boots washed ashore the next day, filled with coral. The coral was in the shape of a cathedral spire. No one touched it. Omega-13 offered to burn the boots. But when they opened their cleansing field, the coral sang, a single tone, exactly matched to the final bell note. They withdrew. A new term began circulating among the guardsmen. Drowned saints, whispered first, then spoken openly, eventually carved into the chapel ruins that still jutted out from the surf at low tide, a single stone slab that refused to erode. The drowned saints wait for you. Below it, a single Aquila turned sideways, half submerged in black kelp. Command attempted an orbital scan. It returned static. Specs from fleet ships reported the ocean had no depth, not immeasurable, absent. The sensors registered terrain, then blank space, as if the seafloor had been removed from memory. One fleet astropath wept blood for 6 hours after trying to parse the feed. Her last words, "He watches through the pressure." Then, the bleeding began. Not violent, not fast. Just a slow weep of salt water from the eyes, the ears, the nose, only during morning hymn, only for those who'd stood near the coast. No pain, only calm. Some called it a blessing. Others locked themselves in rusting chimera holes and refused to sleep. Then the bells rang midday. First time in cycle breach. No pattern, no warning, just a single note, sharp, piercing. Every screen flickered, every vox sputtered, every soldier near the sea stood and turned and prompted, unspeaking and knelt. Those who tried to intervene found their rifles too hot to hold. Their Auspex readings looped backwards, their boots filled slowly with cold water, even on dry soil. A junior commissar attempted to fire into the crowd. His bolt pistol backfired. Salt crystal exploded from the chamber. His lungs crystallized. Before he could scream, he fell kneeling. The others welcomed him with bowed heads. By nightfall, every standard had a salt-trapped rope tied to its top. Chaplains claimed heresy. The troops called it homecoming. The final record recovered from coastal Vox picked up something beneath the waves. Not speech, chant, layered, timed, endless. 3 syllables. Looped, not in any known dialect, but one lex matched it phonetically to a forgotten ship lost with the glory of Saint Morn, a vessel that vanished during the Great Crusade. Its last transmission. We go down singing. The bells still ring. The painting arrived without requisition. No munitorum stamp, no seal of station or transit log. It was simply there, hung in the command center's north wall between the tactical hololith and the ration manifest. No one remembered seeing it installed. No servitor recalled carrying it. Vox recordings from the previous shift showed only a blank wall. Then, 1 hour later, it stood framed in black iron, canvas taut, oil still wet to the scent. At first, they thought it was a gift, a gesture of morale from a distant Lord Militant or a The face it bore was unmistakably his brow, crowned with golden laurels, eyes unblinking, gaze locked upon some far and holy vision, and yet, not quite. The eyes didn't glow. They stared, unmoving, not radiant, but fixed, like they were waiting for something, like the canvas held breath. No record of this depiction existed. It didn't match any of the 10,000 approved iconographies stored in the Cathedral Munitorum archives. The angle was wrong, the mouth too narrow, the pupils not stars, not flame but black, wet, deep. Some officers turned the portrait toward the wall. Others insisted it remained visible during briefings, claiming it centered their judgment. It began with names. Lieutenant Varlin misaddressed a field order signing it, not with his own designation, but Servant 73orum. When corrected, he stared in confusion, as though the rank he'd worn for 6 years was unfamiliar. Later, Captain Elia, fluent in 4 dialects of Low Gothic and 2 in Bin, failed to recognize her birth name on her personnel file. She said it aloud. It sounded wrong in her mouth, like stone grinding on glass. She'd been staring at the painting the night before, unblinking for 40 minutes. Then came the writing. A junior tactician submitted deployment orders in High Gothic pristine, grammar, ornate script, sealed with wax he could not account for. His normal literacy level barely reached secondary lexicons. The signature, Vigil Orus. The rank affixed was Aegis Intercessor, a title that hadn't existed since the 31st millennium. The orders were flawless, tactically sound, but the target coordinates led to a mountain range that didn't appear on any maps. When a recon drone was sent, it vanished 10 seconds into the cloud line. No signal, no wreckage, no echo. They opened the painting's frame. Inside, instead of backing, they found parchment hundreds of sheets stitched behind the canvas. Each bore a single phrase, repeated in exact spacing and identical hand. The eye does not blink because it already knows. The words wrapped around themselves in mirrored glyphs. Medicae reports filed the script as not. Psychana disagreed. Sanctioned Psyker Helen 37 approached the painting during evaluation. She collapsed mid-step, eyes wide, pupils spiraled. She spoke in hexameter, not prophecy, not warning. A list. 70-8 names. All officers stationed on world. She named them in order of rank. Those already dead were named first. Those still living were marked with the word unrealized. She did not wake. her body remained alive. Brain activity spiked only when the painting was uncovered. Security attempted to remove the canvas. They failed. It was not nailed, bolted, or locked. But whenever they turned their backs, it returned to the wall. Not violently, not suddenly, just passively reappeared, as if it had never moved. Footage showed no movement, just a slow flicker in lighting, 1 second absence, next second presence. The chaplain assigned to the command center began sleeping under it. He claimed its gaze kept his dreams honest, that it showed him the sins he would commit, not the ones he had. He started writing sermons that contradicted the Lectitio Divinitatis subtle inversions, rhetorical knots. He preached them aloud during downtime. Officers listened. At first, they laughed. Then, they asked for copies. When the commissariat ordered his execution, the bolt-round misfired chamber melted, gunner blinded. The chaplain knelt and whispered, "The eye watches even mercy." He was reassigned. The painting remained. A week later, 6 officers went missing. No breach, no alert, just absence. Their quarters showed no signs of struggle. Their data slates still logged in. Their meals uneaten, cooling where left. The painting's gaze had shifted. Before, it stared outward. Now, it faced slightly downward, to the command table. They tested the oil. It wasn't paint, microscopic. Analysis revealed particulate matter, consistent with powdered bone, neurodust, and a single unknown compound that reacted to synaptic proximity when brought within 2 meters of an active human mind. The pigment warmed. A tech priest attempted dissection. He screamed before the scalpel touched canvas, declared himself unworthy of the unblinking, then removed his own ocular implants with a soldering iron. No one approached it again. One officer proposed wrapping the painting, obscuring its view. They found him the next day in a fugue state, kneeling before the blank wall, whispering coordinates that traced a spiral into the northern hemisphere. That spiral matched the orbital decay path of the glory of St. Morn, a lost ship presumed destroyed 3 millennia prior. Its final vox log ended with, "We go dark in light that will not close its eyes." The resemblance to the painting's title was noted, then redacted. A new behavior emerged. When viewed through indirect means reflections, pict feeds, or auspex, the painting moved, not visibly, but inconsistencies appeared. Reflections showed closed eyes. Auspex mapped 3 faces instead of 1. One angle showed the emperor laughing, another showed weeping, a third showed nothing, just a black sun over a broken throne. Some claimed they saw themselves on the throne. Others saw the throne empty and felt relief. That's when the dreams began, not visions. Shared narrative. Multiple officers reported the same dream, standing in a hallway with no doors, facing a painting of the emperor. Except the emperor blinked, once, slowly, then spoke. "You are known." That is not the same as being saved. Upon waking, each had blood seeping from their right nostril, a taste of copper in their mouths. One could no longer speak Logothiconly, a dialect last recorded on Terra 10,000 years prior. The Inquisition was contacted. They investigated. 3 of their number remained behind. One left without speaking. One tried to set fire to the canvas. He burst into flames before the torch struck it. The 3rd sits in silence to this day, cross-legged in front of the portrait, repeating, "The eye sees me, because I looked first." No further orders were issued from the command center. Chain of command collapsed. Inward, officers began referring to each other not by rank but by emotion. "You are dread." "Anger." "Bring me the logisticslate.com. Please relay the coordinates." The Voxtex no longer responded to hails. Only, the painting remained present in daily reports. Still there, still watching. It had not blinked once, but everyone agreed it was waiting too. They first saw it from the ridge beyond, Firebase Aurum 9 just passed the burnt-out husk of the armor column that never made it through the pass. It didn't approach like an enemy. It didn't advance, fire, or maneuver. It just glowed. No shape, no silhouette. Just a smear of wrongness that pressed against the eyes like pressure sickness. Even Uzbek's readings refused to register its presence. They returned. Null values, active scans, passive fields, even psychic echoes came back clean, as if it was not there, but it was. Every man who saw it agreed they'd never seen anything like it before. And yet, somehow, they knew it was watching them. The color defied description. Not invisible, not camouflaged, not shifting, just indescribable. The Vox logs attempted phrasing, like if the idea of regret had a color, like rust if rust were holy, like something sacred that you weren't supposed to look at. No two men gave the same account, but they all trembled when asked. A few vomited. One bit off his own tongue. Sergeant Harvin was the first to collapse. He didn't scream, just sank to his knees and whispered, "It's not part of the Emperor's spectrum." He began drawing in the dust circles inside hexagons, looped infinity lines bending backwards into themselves. When the Medicae arrived, they found he'd blinded himself with a broken ration tin, not out of panic, but methodically, precisely. "It was going to show me its name," he muttered, blood streaming down his cheeks. "I couldn't let it." Others followed. Gunner Tallow tried to fire on it. His laskin melted in his hands, not soft as wax, dripping between his fingers. The heat seared his palms, but he didn't let go. He stared through the rising steam and began laughing. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "It's wrong, but it's beautiful." He kept laughing until the burns reached bone. The 97th Recon Squad reported the same shimmer at 06003 clicks north. They approached in flanking formation, standard patrol discipline. 5 minutes into their sweep, the Vox transmission cut mid. No screams, no impact, just, "We have eyes on the static." They found the squad hours later, equipment intact, weapons unfired, helmets removed. Their eyes were black, not burned, not removed, but black, like the sockets had been filled with obsidian. Each one had a faint smile. No wounds, no struggle, but their veins had ruptured in symmetrical spiral patterns from the chest outward. One survivor emerged, Private Yannick. He wasn't supposed to be with the patrol in disciplinary rations for dereliction. He had wandered off, was behind a rock outcrop relieving himself when the others died. He didn't see it, but he heard it. It hummed, he said, rocking back and forth, but not like sound, like color moving across my bones. He didn't make eye contact, just stared at the floor. I remembered things I never lived. I saw my death, but it hadn't happened yet. It wasn't mine. They put him in solitary. An hour later, he tried to claw out his own ear. "It's still humming," he screamed. "And it's learning how to sing." The tech priests attempted filtration screens. They built visual dampeners, cognition breakers, even deployed a blessed servitor with no optical nerves. Nothing worked. The moment you knew it was there, your mind tried to compensate. That's when it got in. It wasn't warps. The Psychana confirmed that. No warp echoes. No demonic traces. Just presence. Presence that refused to be interpreted. Chaplains declared it a trial, a test of doctrinal purity. They ordered squads to march directly into its light, chanting verses from the Litany of Sight. None returned. A week later, the color moved, not advanced, moved, repositioned. It didn't glow brighter. It simply shifted, and every creature in its path, from feral groks to hardened Warmex. Animals froze mid-step. Machinery halted mid. Even the wind stalled. The world blinked only once. And when it did, every picked capture frame from the surrounding region went blank. Just white. Not a glitch. Not static. White pure. full frame white, burned into the cogitator core of every device. One image survived, a blurred figure, armor-scorched eyes bandaged in pitch-black cloth. He stood alone, lasgun holstered, hands empty, facing the horizon, a scribbled note in low Gothic read. If you can't name the color, it can't rewrite you. No one could identify him, no matching service record, no dog tag. But that image circulated, was passed from regiment to regiment, and soon, soldiers began bandaging their own eyes with black cloth, voluntarily, at first as superstition, then as ritual. Medicaid protested, visibility compromised, target acquisition degraded, command was alarmed, orders were issued, compliance failed, troopers simply refused. "I'd rather miss than change," one corporal whispered, "and that's what it wants, to make us see differently." One officer, Commander Brell, ordered a full wipe of all ocular contamination cases, reassignments, disarmament, punishment protocols. She lasted 3 days, then walked, barefoot, into the fog beyond the perimeter. She was found 3 hours later, face turned away from camp, her body intact, but her uniform had changed. The Aquila on her chest was inverted, painted over in that color that no one could name. When they looked directly at it, they couldn't remember what they'd seen. 3 guardsmen died during the examination, not from wounds, but from disassociation. Their minds cracked from trying to assign language to memory. One attempted to speak and forgot what breath was. After that, the perimeter was drawn tighter. New standing orders, no engagement, no direct observation, all contact prohibited, firing arcs to remain fixed at compass-locked angles, all visual confirmation handled via Auspex relay. But Auspex still read null. The color remained untouchable, UNDEFINABL. One day it was gone, just like that. No impact, no light dot, just absence. And yet, things didn't return to normal. Not exactly. Some men still paused during routine scans, stared at empty corners, flinched at unlit shadows. The hue had burned after midges, not onto their retinas, but into the part of the mind that dreams. They couldn't describe it, couldn't picture it, but they remembered, reacting to it, and the memory of fear held longer than the fear itself. No official record mentions the event. No commendations were issued. Only a single line appears in a secured data slate, buried in Subvault 12 beneath. Command Bastion Arakan. Unknown phenomenon. Visual entropy variant. Terminus classification. Uncolor. Recommend planetary quarantine. Contagion. Linguistic. Linguistic, because to speak of it is to try naming it, and names, in the Emperor's domain, hold power. But this one should not, and still, in the outer regiments. Some guardsmen wear black cloth over their eyes just in case, because they know the color is not gone, it's waiting to be remembered. At first, they blamed the Vox units, some interference, some glitch in the relay towers stretching across the obsidian flats of Vaskrin Ridge. No one panicked. Vox silence was common enough during the atmospheric surges of war plasma discharges, misaligned frequency loops, or magnetic storms crawling through upper orbit. The squad might go mute for hours, even days. They waited, retried the ping, checked the lines, replaced cables, boosted signal gain, but the static didn't return. That was the first sign. Not silence, the absence of noise, pretending to be silence, because true silence had weight. This didn't. This absence felt curated, tailored. It responded to attention. When Corporal Vel tried singing during perimeter rounds out of habit, a low hymn about Saint Solarne's torch, the sound caught in her throat mid. Not pain, not obstruction, just stopped. She opened her mouth, forced air, formed syllables, but they landed nowhere. Not even her own ears heard it. The others turned. They'd seen her singing. They could read her lips, but no sound followed. She tried again, nothing. Later, she tapped her foot to check if it was her alone. That sound arrived before her boot hit the stone. That's when they knew something else was listening. No gunfire had been heard for 3 days. Not theirs. Not the enemy's. No mortar. No loss rounds. No thunder from the orbital batteries. But battle damage still accumulated. Structures warped. Barricades smoldered. Men vanished. The war had not stopped. It had only gone quiet. Private Yas reported, hearing footsteps outside the trench at 0300 hours. He stood, called a challenge. No response. He waited. The footfalls stopped. Then, after 5 seconds, started again from behind him. He turned. No one there. He wrote it off as nerves. Echo tricks. Pressure from rations gone too long spoiled. Until the next night, when the footfalls came again, but this time, they arrived before he stood to hear them. Echoes. Pre-echo sounds before their causes. Sergeant Gran attempted to log the anomaly in his field journal. He scribbled his name, the date, the entry line, and then found the next sentence already written. It waits where breath goes. The ink matched. The pen hadn't moved. Others began speaking less, not out of superstition, but fear of being answered, because answers came. During mess, during marches, during quiet moments in the latrine, answers to things no one had voiced. Private Darn muttered a thought. I wonder what happened to the 41st. From across the tent, someone replied. They drowned in the dust. He turned. It was Lieutenant Hask. But Hask swore he hadn't said anything. His mouth hadn't moved, and his eyes looked as confused as Darn's. It escalated. Thoughts began returning, not as memories but as external statements. Soldiers would catch themselves reacting. 2 words they hadn't spoken aloud. I need to clean my rifle, they'd think, canned across the bunker. A voice would mutter, then clean it. Not instruction, not command. Reaction. As if the air itself had learned to talk back. The psychers refused to enter the sector. Even shielded, even sedated, they recoiled at the threshold. I hear listening. One gasped before seizing. The air leans too close. It has no mouth, but it leans. Medicaid protocols failed. One guardsman choked on a scream he hadn't meant to make. His throat swelled, not from injury, but because his silence had become unnatural. Later, an Auspex crew set up vibration mapping to chart sound fields across the forward trench. No sound waves were detected. None, not even ambient wind. Boot treads, gear shifts, but the instruments still moved. Needles twitched. Graphs fluctuated. Readings showed input, but there was no sound, only presence. Captain Varn ordered a withdrawal to Bastion, Saracen. Reinforcement corridors went black. Vox confirmations never arrived. The supply convoy returned empty. Drivers gone. Cargo untouched. Engines still running. Every tank sat idle in silence. Hatches closed. No blood. No struggle. Just gone. One comms officer suggested the enemy had employed sonic suppression tech, but Auspex showed nothing. No residuals. No mechanical fields. No psychic interference. And then the dreams began. At first, they were simple. Marching down corridors that had no walls. Following echoes without sound. Clutching weapons that pulsed like lungs. Reciting orders they hadn't received yet. Then they stopped dreaming in images. Just ... sound. A voice never loud. Never direct. Not speech. More like context pressed into their ears. Like meaning without shape. Like being read from inside out. One trooper wept for an entire hour, curled in a corner, repeating a single phrase. I don't want it to understand me. That's when they began taping their mouths. Some stitched them shut. Voluntarily, not as penance, not as ritual, as warning. Because the ones who kept speaking started unraveling, not bodily, cognitively, They repeated phrases, finished other people's sentences, answered questions no one had thought of yet. Some spoke backwards, others in palindromes. One wrote a full tactical doctrine for a battle that had not happened down to casualty rosters. And when asked how he knew, he replied, "I heard them dying tomorrow, soon." Officers outlawed speech entirely. Orders were written, gestures used, marches conducted in absolute silence. And yet, the silence grew deeper, heavier, as if the absence of speech fed it. The less they spoke, the more it learned. And then came the chorus. One night, at 0200, across 5 trenches and 3 regimental camps, every soldier heard the same thing, a chorus of voices, not screaming, not chanting, repeating names, serial numbers, birthplaces, confessions, some real, some not. Some soldiers heard themselves say things they'd never done. Others recognized the voices as comrades long dead or not yet born. The silence wasn't just listening anymore, it was answering itself, and in its echo, identity began to collapse. Who had spoken first? Who had thought the thought? Who remembered what? By the end of the week, 27 soldiers requested reassignment. One by one, the requests were identical word for word, punctuation exact. Each had been written separately, by hand, under supervision. None of them remembered doing it. Eventually, they stopped speaking altogether, not from command, from futility. Words no longer meant anything. The silence had learned their meanings and returned them tainted. Vox units were dismantled. Orders relayed through sigil boards and color-coded flares, but even those began to flicker in patterns that no one could confirm. Initiating. The silence watched, not with eyes, but with intention. One final entry was logged in the command data slate before its memory core wiped itself clean. Speech defines the self. Remove speech, remove self. Now it defines us. We answer before we know the question. We echo forward. The silence hears, because it remembers better than we do. And beneath the bunk of the last conscious officer, scratched into the floorboards with a broken fingernail, a final sentence waited. Do not think too loud, because now, even that might echo. It began, like all endings do, in War II, quiet to trust. The last enemy signal faded 3 days ago. Not jammed, not masked, gone. Auspex arrays stretched full spectrum across the horizon and returned only truth. The enemy was dead, vaporized, mutilated, dissolved into ash and dust. No biometrics registered, no residual psychic trace. The war was over. By all protocols, they had one dot, and yet no one cheered. The sky did not brighten. Command issued formal declarations from Bastion lexicon. Primary objective secured. Sector fully pacified. All units granted commendation in the name of the Emperor Most High. Victory hymns played over the trenchline, distorted only slightly by static. But none sang along. The 82nd Cadian Iron Wall was scheduled for immediate evac. Dropcraft descended with ceremonial precision. Medicae loaded the wounded first, then officers, then rank and file, protocol, discipline, hierarchy. The code held until the first shuttle lifted and caught fire in silence. Not from weapons, not from sabotage. It burned from the inside out. A bloom of azure flame, no heat, no explosion, just inversion. Every surface turned concave. Screams blinked out before they finished. The fire did not spread. It simply wasn't then, wasn't. Nothing remained. No smoke, no wreckage. Just a crater, still warm, pulsing like a cauterized nerve. Command grounded all further launches. Orbital stations were contacted. No response. The relay satellites spun in place, not broken, not disabled, but every transmission bounced back, inverted. The code flipped like a reflection in a broken mirror. Every evac ship waiting above the stratosphere reported the same problem. Stellar vectors no longer aligned. The warp coordinates fluctuated. Astrogation lenses showed stars where none should be and none where there always had been. The stars had moved, or worse, they hadn't. The system had reoriented itself around them, as if sealing them in. Some called it anomaly, spatial drift, gravitic lensing. Others whispered the heretical word, curse. Captain Threll of the 9th Dravenite Rifles led a sortie to test ground Exodus. They followed their original ingress path to the Tertius Pass, marked by burned trees and promethium-cracked roadways. Nothing was familiar. The landmarks were correct but wrong. The trees stood again. The craters filled. The pass was no longer a pass, just a wall of cliff and vine. When Threll returned, he brought back a stone, carved with his own name, dated the day before they arrived. On World. He never spoke again. Morale broke without ceremony. Soldiers stopped requesting transfer. There was nowhere to transfer to. The perimeter became circular, no matter the direction marched. Survey drones flew out, reporting live feeds for exactly 7 minutes, then returned, weathered, rusted, and decayed, as if they'd spent centuries abroad. 1. Drone's internal chronometer read 1 for 2 years. MEDICAE dismissed it as malfunction. Then it happened again and again. Temporal drift was suggested. The priesthood disagreed. They offered another explanation. Divine containment. The Omnissiah had closed the circuit. Some believed it, some needed to, because the alternative was simpler and worse. Victory had never been escaped. It had been the trigger, a final condition met, a ritual completed. One that required their enemy's death, not as triumph but as tithe. The enemy had not fought to win. They had fought to end. The last transmission recovered from the enemy stronghold was audio only. No language, just a single word, repeated intranslatable, pulsing, modulated across frequencies. But one Lex mechanic decrypted it into binaric approximation. Now, that was all. Now begins what follows. Now that you have won. Now that you cannot leave. Command, attempted denial. Awards were issued, posthumous commendations, honor scrolls. But the brass knew. They just stopped mentioning evac dates. The sermons changed. 2. Chaplains stopped preaching ascension. They began preaching permanence. That service here was eternal, that this soil was sanctified by struggle, and all who lived upon it must remain as its guardians. Scripture rewrote itself daily. One priest claimed his Lectitio Divinitatis glowed under moonlight tanned. The margins now bore maps of the same base, built larger. Deeper. As if planning its own expansion. Guardsmen assigned to latrine duty discovered tunnels beneath the supply wing. Tunnels not on the blueprints, lined with pictographs etched into stone. Not enemy symbols, not imperial either. Something anticipatory. Depictions of events not yet lived. One showed a shuttle catching fire. Another, a field of men kneeling to trees that bled oil. Another, a chapel grown from bone. All bore the same final sigil, an eye with no pupil, encircled in thorns. The administratum considered raising the site, but demolition charges failed. Plasma cores refused ignition. AIM declared the circuitry spiritually inert. They attempted melting. Walls absorbed the heat, melted the blades. When reinforcements were finally summoned from the outer sectors, the shuttles arrived, automated. No crew aboard, no pilots, no instructions. Just doors that opened on cue. 3 units entered. None returned. The doors stayed open, but the crafts would not lift. They had become rooms, not vehicles. A new corridor had formed within one carved into the rear bulkhead. It led downward, further than the craft should allow. The air inside remained breathable, pressure normal, but gravity wrong, pulling slightly. Sideways. Command sealed the craft. Posted guards. The guards disappeared within the week. New ones volunteered, out of curiosity at first, then compulsion. A trooper was found, writing in his own blood on the barracks wall. The exit is shaped like a rival. He didn't remember doing it. No one punished him. The chaplain read the phrase aloud and nodded. Double quotes. Yes, he whispered. It makes sense now. They began organizing patrols into these anomalies, scouting the tunnels, mapping the crafts. But the maps never held. The paths changed. The shapes reformed. One soldier returned with moss growing behind his eyes. Another had teeth in his stomach, still chewing. No injuries, no pain, just Edison's. Yet still. No enemy, no fire exchanged, just presence, just permanence. Time itself thinned. Officers forgot their deployments. Sergeants confused their own ranks. One trooper insisted he'd never left his homeworld, and this had all been a dream broadcast by a bored god. He was confined, then copied. Another soldier, same face, same voice, same serial, was found guarding the mess line. Neither recognized the other. Both claimed to be the original. DNA matched. Both were correct. When the High Inquisitor finally arrived, the stars shifted once again. His fleet blinked out of existence before entering a TMO. No warning, no sound, just light blue, an infinite burning, a silhouette across the clouds that never faded. That was when Bastion Lexicon renamed itself, not officially, not by command, by consensus, by feeling. No plaque, no decree, just a name spoken softly by every mouth, uncoordinated and unknowing. The name was the last post, a final position, a final stand. Except there was no enemy, no escape, only survival, and the unspoken truth behind every ration, every rotation, every unblinking stare into the ash-hung horizon. The war was not meant to end. A machine made of men who forgot they were men. They still marched, still guarded, still swept for mines that no longer beeped. They cleaned weapons, no longer fired. They maintained purity sigils on armor, no longer read. And in the command throne, the last functioning servitor clicked a new data slate into its rusted port. On the screen, one phrase, blinking, awaiting next directive. It had been waiting for 70 years. It would wait 70 more. Or 7,000. Until the voice returned on, until the signal changed, until a new war called, but none came. Only silence. And the endless whisper of boots and dust, because they had been told to serve, and no one ever told them to stop. So they still do. Even now, the stars above Rosk's Landing no longer shine, but deep within its broken arteries, something moves. Not hope, not life, just motion. Patrols, rotations, flickers of half-lit devotion. The war ended everywhere else, but here, the silence is louder than victory, and the breathless persistence of those left behind hums louder than memory. Their names are gone, their mission long obsolete, but their steps echo with perfect rhythm. Somewhere, a data slate still blinks. Somewhere, a ruined chapel still rings. Somewhere, a hand still hovers near a bolter trigger, waiting for a threat that will never come. This is not death. It is obedience hardened into eternity, and so they march not toward purpose, not away from madness, but simply because that is what they were told to do. The Imperium forgets its dead, but the dead do not forget their orders. They do not rest. They do not rot. They simply continue until the sky itself turns black with rust, and even the God Emperor averts his gaze, because on this world, the greatest heresy was not rebellion. It was loyalty without end. And in the dust, beneath ruined banners and melted Aquillas, they still serve. Because no one ever said, "You may stop."